You value the profit from a single blue feather more than the life of the woman who gave you yours. Her reward was 17 stab wounds. This court sentences you to 40 years.
On January 13, 2022, 17-year-old Eric Atkins stabbed his mother, Monica Atkins, to death in their home after a heated argument about his involvement with a criminal friend. The teenager then attacked his brother-in-law, Trevor Snye, with a pair of scissors when he attempted to call 911, leaving both victims bleeding profusely. The double stabbing shocked everyone in the quiet residential neighborhood of Kendall, where Monica had raised her family for over a decade, working tirelessly as a caregiver to support them. What began as a mother's concerned confrontation about her son's increasingly suspicious behavior ended in a brutal display of violence that would forever alter the lives of everyone connected to the Atkins family. If you're watching this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on all our true crime coverage. We'd love to hear where you're watching from, so drop your location in the comments below. The January evening had started like any other in the Atkins household, with Monica returning home from her shift, caring for elderly patients at a nearby nursing facility. According to neighbors who later spoke with investigators, they had heard raised voices coming from the single-story stucco home around 7:30 p.m., which wasn't entirely unusual given Eric's troubled history and frequent confrontations with his mother. The argument this time, however, centered on something that Monica had discovered earlier that week, evidence connecting her son to an illegal operation run by his older friend, Zach Thompson. Text messages recovered from Monica's phone would later reveal her growing concern about exotic birds and animals she had seen in photos on her son's social media accounts, animals that she knew were protected, endangered, and illegal to possess. The confrontation escalated rapidly in the kitchen of the family home, where Monica had prepared dinner as she attempted to reason with her increasingly agitated son. Investigators believe Eric retrieved a kitchen knife from the drawer next to the refrigerator when his mother threatened to contact authorities about his involvement in what she suspected was an exotic animal smuggling operation. The medical examiner's report would later confirm that Monica suffered 17 stab wounds to her chest, neck, and abdomen, with defensive wounds on her hands and forearms indicating she had desperately tried to shield herself from her son's frenzied attack. Blood spatter analysis conducted by Miami-Dade forensic specialists suggested that Monica had backed away from her attacker, moving from the kitchen island toward the pantry door, before collapsing near the refrigerator, where her body was later found. The violence didn't end with Monica's death, as Trevor Snye, who had been married to Eric's older sister for 3 years, arrived at the house to drop off groceries he had purchased for his mother-in-law on his way home from his delivery route. Trevor, 27, entered through the front, doctor calling out to Monica, unaware of the horror that awaited him in the kitchen. According to Trevor's later testimony, he first noticed blood smeared along the hallway wall before he saw Eric standing over Monica's body, still holding the knife. When Trevor reached for his phone to call 911, Eric lunged at him with a pair of scissors he grabbed from a nearby counter, stabbing him repeatedly in the hands, arms, and shoulders. Despite his injuries, Trevor managed to partially dial 911 before dropping his phone and fleeing to a neighbor's house, leaving a trail of blood across the driveway that would later guide first responders to the scene. By the time police arrived at 8:12 p.m., responding to what dispatch had logged as an incomplete emergency call with possible distress sounds, Eric Atkins had fled the scene. Officers found Monica's body in the kitchen, surrounded by a massive pool of blood that had begun to congeal, and Trevor barely conscious in the neighbor's living room, where he had collapsed after pounding on their door for help. The responding officers immediately secured the perimeter and called for backup, knowing that somewhere in Miami, a dangerous teenager was on the run, his hands still stained with the blood of his own mother. The Miami-Dade Police Department issued an immediate BOLO, be on the lookout, alert for Eric, describing him as armed, dangerous, and potentially seeking assistance from known associates, particularly his friend Zach Thompson, whose name Trevor had managed to share before being rushed to Jackson Memorial Hospital. As crime scene technicians processed the Akins home, the horror of what had transpired became increasingly clear through the physical evidence left behind. The kitchen, once a gathering place for family meals, had been transformed into a scene of unimaginable violence, with blood spatter reaching the ceiling and bloody handprints marking the walls where Monica had tried to steady herself during the attack. The murder weapon, a 7-inch chef's knife, was found discarded in the sink, apparently rinsed hastily, but still bearing traces of blood in the handle's grooves. The scissors used to attack Trevor were recovered from the hallway floor. Bent at an odd angle from the force with which they had been used, the metal handles smeared with both victims' blood, as confirmed by later DNA analysis. What puzzled investigators initially was the presence of something unexpected among the blood and chaos. A brilliant blue feather, approximately 6 inches long, found partially hidden under the kitchen table. The feather, which appeared to be from no ordinary local bird, was speckled with blood droplets that matched Monica's DNA. Detective James Davis, a veteran of Miami-Dade's Homicide Division with 15 years of experience investigating violent crimes, carefully placed the feather in an evidence bag, suspecting it might be significant given the argument about exotic animals that Trevor had mentioned. Before losing consciousness, this single feather, striking in its vivid blue coloration and unusual size, would soon become the linchpin in unraveling not only the murder case, but also a sophisticated criminal enterprise operating in the shadows of Miami's glamorous facade. As the night deepened and the investigation gained momentum, detectives began piecing together Eric's movements in the hours before the attack. Security footage from a convenience store 3 blocks from the Akins home showed Eric purchasing energy drinks at 5:43 p.m., appearing agitated and checking his phone repeatedly. The cashier remembered him because he had been a regular customer, but seemed unusually tense that evening, paying with cash instead of the card he normally used. Additional footage from a bus stop camera captured Eric meeting with another young man approximately 1 hour before the estimated time of the murder, engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation. With Eric gesturing emphatically, and the other young man, later identified as Zach Thompson, handing him something that Eric quickly tucked into his jacket pocket. By midnight, the Miami-Dade Police Department had assembled a task force dedicated to locating Eric Akins, with officers stationed at known hangouts, transportation hubs, and the homes of his friends. The gravity of the crime, a teenage son murdering his mother and attempting to kill his brother-in-law, generated immediate media attention, with local news stations breaking into regular programming to broadcast Eric's photo and warn the public not to approach him, but to call authorities immediately if spotted. Social media lit up with shocked reactions from Eric's classmates and acquaintances, many expressing disbelief that the quiet, sometimes withdrawn boy they knew could be capable of such violence, while others hinted at disturbing changes in his behavior over the past year as he had fallen under the influence of Zach Thompson, a 22-year-old with a minor criminal record who lived in an apartment in Miami Beach. The relationship between Eric and his mother had been complicated for years, according to family friends interviewed by detectives in the hours following the murder. Monica, a single mother since Eric was 5, had worked multiple jobs to support her 2 children, eventually settling into her role as a caregiver, where her natural compassion and patience made her beloved by her elderly clients and respected by her colleagues. Despite her dedication to providing for her family, Eric had begun showing signs of rebellion around age 14, his grades dropping precipitously from his previous honor roll status, and his circle of friends shifting from the soccer teammates and neighbor kids he'd grown up with to older, less savory characters who neighbors had noticed coming and going at odd hours when Monica was working her night shifts. What no one realized at the time was that these small rebellions were merely the prelude to Eric's involvement in a criminal operation that would ultimately lead him to commit the most unforgivable act imaginable. As dawn broke over Miami on January 14th, the city awakened to news of the manhunt and gruesome details of the double stabbing that had left one dead and another seriously injured. Schools in the area implemented security protocols as a precaution, though investigators believed Eric had likely fled far from his home neighborhood. Trevor Snye remained in critical but stable condition at Jackson Memorial Hospital, surrounded by his wife, Eric's older sister, and other family members who kept a somber vigil while providing additional information to detectives about Eric's recent behavior. The family's grief was compounded by confusion and disbelief as they struggled to reconcile the image of the boy they had known with the violent young man who had destroyed their family in a matter of minutes. What none of them yet understood was how a single exotic feather would soon connect this family tragedy to a much larger criminal enterprise operating in the shadows of Miami's glittering exterior. Monica Atkins was far more than just a murder victim. She was a 42-year-old single mother who had dedicated her life to caring for others, both professionally and personally. For the past 8 years, she had worked as a caregiver at Sunset Palms Assisted Living Facility in Coral Gables, where colleagues described her as exceptionally compassionate, patient, and committed to making her elderly clients' final years comfortable and dignified. Monica's supervisor, Ellen Merritt, told investigators that Monica regularly worked overtime to cover shifts when other caregivers called out sick, often sacrificing her own rest to ensure that vulnerable seniors received consistent care. Her clients adored her for the small, thoughtful touches she added to their care, remembering their grandchildren's names, bringing in photographs of Miami's beautiful sunsets when they couldn't go outside, or simply sitting and listening to their stories with genuine interest when family members couldn't visit. Before becoming a caregiver, Monica had worked a series of retail and service jobs while putting herself through nursing assistant courses at Miami-Dade College, determined to build a better life for her children after her divorce. Former classmates remembered her rushing from evening classes to night shifts, textbooks in hand, often studying during her breaks and between clients. The path hadn't been easy. Financial struggles had forced the family to move 3 times during Eric's elementary school years before they finally settled in the modest Kendall neighborhood home where Monica would ultimately lose her life. Despite these hardships, neighbors recalled Monica's unfailing optimism and her dedication to creating a stable home environment, decorating for every holiday and organizing small birthday celebrations for her children even when money was tight. Monica's relationship with her son Eric had grown increasingly strained over the previous 2 years, though text messages and conversations with friends revealed she never stopped trying to reach him. Her phone contained dozens of articles she had bookmarked about teen psychology, substance abuse warning signs, and parenting troubled adolescents, alongside numerous unanswered text messages to Eric expressing concern, offering support, and attempting to establish boundaries. Just 3 weeks before her murder, Monica had reached out to a youth counselor at Eric's school, expressing worry about his dramatic personality changes and requesting resources that might help her reconnect with her increasingly distant son. The counselor later told police that Monica had been tearful during their meeting, blaming herself for working such long hours and wondering if her absence had somehow contributed to Eric's troubling behavior. Beyond her roles as caregiver and mother, Monica was a woman with dreams and passions of her own that would never be realized. A half-finished application to a registered nursing program was found on her laptop, along with a budget spreadsheet where she had been saving small amounts from each paycheck toward tuition. Friends described her love of gardening, her small backyard filled with native Florida plants, and a vegetable garden that supplied fresh produce for family meals. Monica's sister told investigators about their shared plans to visit Cuba, their parents' homeland, for the first time together when Monica turned 45, a trip that had been Monica's dream since childhood, but that she had postponed repeatedly to prioritize her children's needs. These glimpses into Monica's hopes and aspirations made the brutality of her murder all the more tragic, a life of selfless dedication cut short by the very person for whom she had sacrificed so much. The second victim, Trevor Snye, survived the attack but was left with permanent nerve damage that threatened his career as a delivery driver for a local shipping company. The 27-year-old had married Monica's daughter Elisa 3 years earlier, and colleagues described him as a dependable, hard-working employee who often volunteered for overtime shifts to help support his wife through nursing school. Trevor's supervisor noted that he had never missed a day of work in 4 years until the attack, maintaining a perfect safety record while delivering packages throughout Miami's busy streets. The injuries to his hands, sustained as he raised them to defend against Eric's frenzied scissor attack, required 3 surgeries and extensive physical therapy, with doctors warning that he might never regain full dexterity in his right hand. Trevor and Monica had shared a close bond, with Trevor often referring to his mother-in-law as his second mom, and stopping by regularly to help with household repairs or simply to share a meal. On the night of the murder, Trevor had been bringing groceries he had purchased for Monica, knowing she would be tired after her shift and wanting to save her an errand. Elisa later told investigators through tears that this was typical of her husband's thoughtfulness, explaining how Trevor had grown up in foster care and had embraced her family as his own, particularly appreciating Monica's warmth and acceptance. The scissors that nearly claimed Trevor's life had been a Christmas gift from him to Monica just 3 weeks earlier, a high-quality pair she had admired for her sewing projects, but considered too expensive to purchase for herself. The impact of Monica's death rippled through multiple communities, creating a void that could never truly be filled. The elderly residents at Sunset Palms held their own memorial service, many weeping openly as they shared stories of Monica's kindness, how she had sat with Mr. Goldstein during his wife's funeral when his own children couldn't attend, or the time she had come in on her day off to help Mrs. Rodriguez video call with her new grandchild in California. Monica's church community at St. Michael's Catholic Parish established a scholarship fund in her name for single mothers pursuing careers in healthcare, recognizing how she had struggled and persevered to build her career while raising her children. Her neighbor, Diane Winters, organized a community garden project dedicated to Monica's memory, telling reporters, "She always said that growing things gave her hope, and we need that hope now more than ever." Perhaps most heartbreaking was the testimony of Monica's elderly clients when interviewed by victim advocates preparing for the trial. 92-year-old Beatrice Coleman, who suffered from early-stage dementia, continued to ask for Monica for weeks after her death, unable to fully comprehend or remember that her favorite caregiver was gone. Arthur Perlman, an 87-year-old Holocaust survivor who had trusted few caregivers before Monica, refused to allow anyone else to help him with his physical therapy exercises, resulting in a significant decline in his mobility. These small but profound impacts illustrated how Monica's nurturing presence had supported so many vulnerable people, making the senselessness of her murder all the more difficult for the community to process and accept. In the days following Monica's death, investigators discovered a journal in her bedside table that provided further insight into her struggles and hopes regarding Eric. The final entry, dated January 12th, just 1 day before her murder, revealed her growing concerns. Found more strange photos on E's social media today. Exotic birds, snakes, even a small monkey. Where is he seeing these animals? Zach's influence is worse than I thought. Have to confront him tomorrow. This has gone too far. The journal detailed months of increasing worry as she noticed cash and expensive items appearing in Eric's possession that he couldn't explain, alongside references to late-night phone calls and secretive behavior. Earlier entries showed a mother desperately trying to understand her changing son. He was such a sweet boy. Where did that child go? How do I reach him before it's too late? Monica's colleagues at Sunset Palms revealed that she had recently been researching wilderness therapy programs and residential treatment options for troubled teens, cutting back on her own expenses to save money for what she feared might be necessary intervention. Her browser history showed numerous searches for how to talk to teen about drug dealing, signs of criminal activity in adolescence, and parenting aggressive teenagers, indicating her growing awareness of the dangerous path her son was traveling. Monica had even reached out to a cousin who worked in law enforcement in Orlando, sending text messages asking about juvenile rehabilitation programs and the potential consequences if a minor was involved in something illegal but not violent. The timing of these inquiries, increasing in frequency and urgency in the weeks before her death, suggested that Monica had been gathering both information and courage before the confrontation that ultimately cost her life. The tragedy of Monica Akins extended beyond her own unfulfilled dreams to the many lives she had touched and supported, creating ripples of loss throughout her community. Her elderly clients lost a compassionate caregiver who treated them with dignity. Her daughter Elisa lost not only a mother, but also her primary source of emotional support as she navigated early marriage and her nursing studies. Trevor lost his second mother and potentially his career due to his injuries. Monica's sister lost her closest confidant and travel companion. The Sunset Palms staff lost a reliable colleague who had covered countless shifts and brought warmth to their workplace. Her neighbors lost the woman who organized block parties and maintained a little free library on her front lawn. Each of these losses represented a thread in the tapestry of a life devoted to nurturing others, a life cut brutally short by the very person Monica had nurtured from birth. As investigators continued gathering information about Monica's life, they discovered something particularly poignant in her work locker, a small collection of thank-you notes and drawings from her elderly clients, carefully preserved in a decorative folder. Among these mementos was a Mother's Day card from Eric, dated 3 years earlier, in which he had written, "Thanks for always believing in me when no one else does." This stark contrast between the appreciative son, who had once recognized his mother's unconditional support, and the angry teenager who had taken her life, would later become a powerful element in the prosecution's case, highlighting the devastating transformation that had occurred as Eric fell under the influence of his older friend and their criminal activities. The card stood as a painful reminder of what had been lost, not just Monica's life, but also the bond between mother and son that had once been strong enough to inspire gratitude and recognition. When the 911 dispatch center received a call at 8:07 p.m. on January 13, 2022, the operator heard only labored breathing, a male voice gasping, "Help! Stabbed!" and the sound of something heavy falling before the line went dead. The partial address captured by the system led Miami-Dade police officers to the 3200 block of Palmetto Avenue, where they began checking houses for signs of disturbance. The officers' attention was immediately drawn to the Akins residence by the sight of bloody footprints on the driveway leading to a neighbor's home, where they found Trevor Snye barely conscious on the front porch, suffering from multiple stab wounds to his hands, arms, and upper chest. While paramedics attended to Trevor, officers Rodriguez and Tanner followed the blood trail back to the Akins home, drawing their weapons as they approached the partially open front door, calling out their presence but receiving no response from within. The scene that greeted the officers inside the home was one that would haunt even these experienced cops for years to come. Monica Akins lay on the kitchen floor in a massive pool of blood, her body bearing multiple stab wounds, her eyes still open in what appeared to be an expression of shock. Initial assessment indicated she had been dead for less than an hour, with the body still warm to the touch and blood not fully congealed. Officer Rodriguez immediately secured the scene and called for homicide detectives, crime scene technicians, and the medical examiner, establishing a perimeter around the property and beginning the meticulous documentation that would form the foundation of the investigation. Meanwhile, Officer Tanner conducted a careful sweep of the home to ensure the attacker wasn't still present, discovering a teenager's bedroom with clothes strewn about and drawers left open, suggesting a hasty departure. Detective James Davis arrived at the scene at 8:43 p.m., bringing 15 years of homicide investigation experience to what was already shaping up to be a complex and disturbing case. Davis, known for his methodical approach and attention to detail, began by walking the perimeter of the scene before entering, noting the blood droplets on the walkway that indicated the direction of the suspect's escape route. Inside, he worked closely with crime scene technicians to document the position of Monica's body, the blood spatter patterns on the walls and cabinets, and the apparent signs of struggle, indicated by overturned chairs and broken dishes. As the lead investigator bent down to examine the area under the kitchen table, where blood spatter suggested important evidence might be found, he spotted something unusual: a striking blue feather approximately 6 inches in length, its vivid color standing out against the terracotta kitchen tiles with what appeared to be blood droplets marring its iridescent surface. "Bag this separately and mark it priority," Detective Davis instructed the evidence technician, his instincts telling him the feather was significant, though he couldn't yet determine why. The detective continued his systematic examination of the crime scene, paying particular attention to a bloody handprint on the refrigerator door that appeared smaller than would be expected from an adult male, consistent with the theory that the 17-year-old Eric was the attacker. A knife block on the counter had an empty slot corresponding to the bloody chef's knife found in the sink, and a family photo hanging crookedly on the wall showed Monica with her arm around a sullen teenage boy who matched the description of Eric alongside a smiling young woman who Davis presumed was Monica's daughter. The smashed remnants of a cell phone lay near the entrance to the hallway where Trevor had been attacked, the screen shattered, but the device possibly still containing retrievable data that might shed light on the events leading to the violence. While Davis coordinated the indoor investigation, his partner, Detective Sophia Reyes, was at Jackson Memorial Hospital attempting to interview Trevor Snye before he went into surgery. Trevor, drifting in and out of consciousness due to blood loss and the pain medication administered by paramedics, managed to provide fragmented but crucial information. Eric stabbed Monica. Argument about animals. Birds, Trevor mumbled, struggling to form coherent sentences as medical staff prepared him for the operating room. Detective Reyes gently pressed for clarification, asking about the animals Trevor had mentioned, to which he responded, "Illegal exotic pets. His friend Zach, selling them." Before medical staff intervened, informing the detective that further questioning would have to wait until after surgery. This brief exchange, however, gave investigators their first insight into the possible motive behind the brutal attack, creating an unexpected connection to the unusual feather found at the crime scene. Back at the Akins home, the medical examiner, Dr. Lydia Patel, arrived to conduct her preliminary assessment of Monica's body, estimating the time of death between 7:30 and 8 p.m., based on body temperature and the state of blood coagulation. Dr. Patel noted the presence of defensive wounds on Monica's forearms and hands, indicating she had tried to protect herself from her attacker. The victim appears to have been stabbed approximately 15 to 17 times, with the fatal wound likely being this one to the carotid artery, Dr. Patel explained, pointing to a deep gash on the side of Monica's neck. The positioning and angle of the wound suggested the attacker was slightly shorter than Monica, consistent with Eric's height as indicated in previous school records. After completing her initial examination, Dr. Patel supervised the careful removal of Monica's body for transport to the medical examiner's office, where a full autopsy would provide more detailed information about the precise cause of death and any additional evidence that might be present on the body. As the night progressed, the Akins home transformed into a hive of investigative activity, with crime scene technicians methodically documenting, photographing, and collecting evidence from every room. Monica's purse, found on the kitchen counter, contained her wallet, keys, and cell phone, eliminating robbery as a potential motive and reinforcing the theory that this was a crime of passion or panic. The phone would prove to be a valuable source of evidence containing text messages between Monica and Eric that documented their deteriorating relationship and her growing concerns about his activities. One message sent just that morning read, "We need to talk when I get home tonight. I know about the animals, Eric. This has to stop before you get into serious trouble." Eric's response, "Stay out of my business," took on a chilling significance in light of the violence that had followed their confrontation. Detective Davis's attention was drawn to Eric's bedroom, where he found further evidence supporting Trevor's fragmented account. Pinned to a bulletin board were several photographs of Eric with an older male, presumably Zach Thompson, posing with what appeared to be exotic reptiles and birds. A quick search of social media platforms on Davis's phone confirmed that these images had also been posted online, though many had recently been deleted, potentially indicating consciousness of guilt. Under the bed, partially hidden by discarded clothing, Davis discovered a shoebox containing several more exotic feathers similar to the one found in the kitchen, along with a substantial amount of cash, over $3,000 in small bills, and a small digital scale of the type commonly used for measuring controlled substances. The discovery suggested that the exotic animal connection might be just one facet of a broader criminal enterprise in which Eric had become involved. While the physical investigation continued at the crime scene, other detectives were already working to locate Eric Akins, obtaining his cell phone number from Monica's contacts and requesting an emergency ping to track its location. The digital forensics team began working on Monica's phone, recovering deleted text messages between her and Eric that revealed escalating tensions over his unexplained absences, sudden access to cash, and concerning new friendships. Of particular interest was a series of exchanges with someone saved as Zach T. that contained veiled references to merchandise, special deliveries, and exotic inventory, strongly suggesting involvement in illegal trafficking. A BOLO, Be on the Lookout alert, was issued for both Eric Akins and Zach Thompson, with their descriptions and last known locations distributed to all law enforcement agencies in Miami-Dade County and neighboring jurisdictions. As dawn approached, Detective Davis made a crucial connection while reviewing the evidence collected so far. The exotic blue feather found at the crime scene wasn't just unusual. It potentially represented a serious federal crime. Davis placed a call to a contact at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, describing the distinctive feather and sending a photograph taken by the crime scene technicians. The federal agent confirmed Davis's suspicions. Based on the coloration, size, and distinctive patterning, the feather appeared to be from a Spix's macaw, one of the rarest birds in the world and believed to be extinct in the wild. Protected under the Endangered Species Act and the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, possession of such a feather, let alone the bird itself, would constitute a federal offense punishable by significant fines and imprisonment. The exotic animal angle had suddenly expanded the case beyond a domestic homicide to potentially include wildlife trafficking, smuggling, and conspiracy charges. The investigation took another turn when detectives obtained surveillance footage from businesses near the O'Keens home. A camera outside a convenience store 3 blocks away had captured Eric entering at 5:43 p.m., appearing agitated and checking his phone repeatedly, and exiting 7 minutes later, carrying a small bag. More significantly, footage from an ATM across the street showed Eric meeting with another young man matching Zach Thompson's description at approximately 6:30 p.m., engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation. The timing suggested this meeting occurred just before Eric returned home and confronted his mother, potentially connecting Zach directly to the events that led to Monica's murder. Detective Davis instructed his team to prioritize locating Thompson, theorizing that he might not only know Eric's current whereabouts, but also have crucial information about the motive behind the killing. By morning, the initial investigation had yielded a substantial body of evidence and a working theory of the crime. Detectives believed that Monica Akins had discovered her son's involvement in an exotic animal smuggling operation run by his friend Zach Thompson, possibly connected to drug distribution, as indicated by the scale and cash found in Eric's room. Monica's confrontation with Eric about these activities had escalated into violence, resulting in her death and the subsequent attack on Trevor Snye when he interrupted the aftermath. The exotic blue feather, now confirmed as belonging to an endangered species, had become the central physical evidence linking the domestic murder to a larger criminal enterprise, potentially providing both the context for the killing and a means of tracking the suspect. As the sun rose over Miami on January 14th, the hunt for Eric Akins intensified, with law enforcement agencies throughout South Florida joining the search for the teenager who had murdered his mother and left his brother-in-law seriously injured, a search that would now focus on known wildlife trafficking channels and their connections to the city's drug trade. The exotic blue feather recovered from the crime scene quickly became the focal point of the investigation, with Detective James Davis recognizing its potential significance beyond being mere physical evidence. Within 24 hours of the murder, the feather had been transported to the University of Miami's Department of Ornithology, where Professor Elena Vasquez, a leading expert on endangered bird species, confirmed what the Fish and Wildlife Service agent had suspected. "This is unquestionably from a Spix's macaw," Professor Vasquez stated, carefully examining the feather under specialized lighting. "These birds are functionally extinct in the wild, with fewer than 160 individuals existing in captivity worldwide, all under strictly monitored breeding programs." The professor explained that the black market value of such a bird could exceed $200,000, making them highly prized targets for wildlife traffickers who supplied wealthy private collectors willing to pay premium prices for the rarest specimens. The feather's presence at the crime scene created a direct link to illegal wildlife trafficking, giving detectives a specific criminal ecosystem to investigate in their search for Eric Akins. Special Agent Marcus Wong from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service joined the investigation, bringing specialized knowledge of wildlife smuggling networks operating in South Florida. Miami is a major hub for exotic animal trafficking due to its international ports and proximity to Central and South America, Agent Wong explained during a briefing with the homicide team. "We've been tracking several operations bringing in protected species through private airstrips and marinas, but haven't previously had intelligence about Spix's macaws specifically." Wong's involvement elevated the case, adding federal resources to the search for Eric and his associate Zach Thompson, who was now suspected of being a key figure in the smuggling operation rather than merely a bad influence on a troubled teen. Detective Sophia Reyes focused her attention on Eric's digital footprint, obtaining warrants for his social media accounts, email, and cloud storage. The digital trail revealed a troubling progression documented in photos and messages spanning the previous 8 months. Early posts showed Eric as a typical, if somewhat disaffected teenager, sharing memes and photos with school friends. By June 2021, however, Zach Thompson began appearing in his posts, and the content shifted dramatically. Photos showed the pair at exclusive Miami nightclubs despite Eric's age, posing with expensive watches and designer clothes they couldn't legitimately afford. Most significantly, beginning in September 2021, Eric had shared, then later deleted, several images of exotic animals, colorful, reptiles, rare tropical birds, and even a juvenile capuchin monkey, often with cryptic captions like, "New merchandise looking good," or "Special delivery for special clients." These digital breadcrumbs led investigators to several other young men who appeared in photos with Eric and Zach, each displaying the same pattern of sudden, unexplained wealth and connections to exotic animals. Detectives interviewed these associates, most of whom claimed minimal knowledge of any illegal activities but admitted that Zach had recruited them to help move merchandise and make deliveries to wealthy clients in Miami Beach, Coral Gables, and other affluent areas. One former associate, speaking on condition of anonymity, provided a crucial lead. Zach operates out of a warehouse in Alapata, but he lives in this fancy apartment in Brickell that his business partner pays for. He calls the guy the professor because he used to teach at some university in Brazil or something. This information suggested the operation had international connections and a hierarchical structure, with Zach serving as a mid-level operator rather than the mastermind. Trevor Sny, recovering from surgery at Jackson Memorial Hospital, provided additional context when Detective Reyes visited him 3 days after the attack. Though still heavily medicated, Trevor was able to recall more details about the argument he had overheard before discovering Monica's body. Monica had found photos on Eric's laptop of him handling these exotic birds in what looked like a warehouse, Trevor explained, wincing as he adjusted his bandaged hands. She confronted him about it that night, saying she'd seen news reports about endangered animals being smuggled through Miami, and that she was going to report it to authorities if he didn't get out of whatever he was involved in. According to Trevor, Eric had become enraged, shouting that she didn't understand how much money was at stake and that she would ruin everything if she went to the police. This testimony corroborated the theory that Monica's threat to expose the smuggling operation had been the direct trigger for Eric's violent attack. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of Monica's phone yielded critical evidence about her growing awareness of her son's criminal activities. In the weeks leading up to her murder, she had conducted numerous searches related to exotic animal trafficking and wildlife protection laws, bookmarking several news articles about recent smuggling busts in Florida. Her text message history showed she had photographed some of Eric's social media posts featuring exotic animals and sent them to her cousin in law enforcement, asking if the animals looked like protected species. Most damning was a draft email found in her account, addressed to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, but never sent, in which she wrote, "I believe my teenage son is involved with people trafficking endangered animals. I've seen evidence of rare birds, reptiles, and possibly primates being kept in improper conditions. I'm afraid for his future and want to get him out before he faces serious charges." The draft was dated January 12th, just 1 day before her murder. The breakthrough in locating Eric came from an unexpected source: a parking ticket issued to Zach Thompson's vehicle 2 hours after Monica's murder. The ticket placed the car in a no-parking zone outside a high-rise apartment building in Brickell, an upscale neighborhood known for its luxury condominiums. Detective Davis immediately dispatched officers to the location, where the building's security staff recognized Thompson's photograph and confirmed he frequently visited a resident on the 31st floor, a Brazilian businessman named Rafael Mendes. A quick background check revealed that Mendes had previously worked as a zoology professor at the University of São Paulo before relocating to Miami 3 years earlier to establish an import-export business specializing in exotic hardwoods and artisanal products from South America. More tellingly, Mendes had been questioned, though never charged, in connection with a wildlife trafficking investigation in Brazil before his departure for the United States. Surveillance was established on Mendes's apartment building while detectives secured emergency warrants based on the murder investigation and the federal wildlife trafficking allegations. At 2:17 a.m. on January 17th, 4 days after Monica's murder, the tactical team observed Zach Thompson and Eric Akins exiting the building and loading several large crates into a van with commercial signage for tropical imports and exports. The timing and furtive behavior of the pair, constantly scanning their surroundings and communicating via hand signals, suggested they were preparing to flee or relocate evidence. Tactical officers moved in quickly, apprehending both suspects without incident as they closed the van's rear doors. Eric Akins, wearing the same jacket visible in the convenience store surveillance footage from the night of the murder, offered no resistance, appearing almost relieved when the officers placed him in handcuffs. The search of the van yielded a trove of evidence directly connecting Eric to both the wildlife smuggling operation and his mother's murder. The crates contained elaborate hidden compartments designed to transport live animals, with several rare reptiles and birds, including 2 juvenile Spix's macaws still inside, destined for delivery to clients. More importantly for the homicide case, Eric's jacket tested positive for blood that would later be confirmed as Monica's, and a small pocket inside the lining contained several blue feathers identical to the one found at the crime scene. A backpack in the van held Eric's passport, $17,000 in cash, and a one-way ticket to Bogota, Colombia, scheduled for departure the following evening, indicating he had been planning to flee the country. The recovery of these items not only placed Eric at the murder scene, but also established a clear connection between the killing and the wildlife trafficking operation, supporting the theory that Monica had been silenced to protect the criminal enterprise. Simultaneously with the arrests, another team of officers and federal agents executed a search warrant at the Alapata warehouse, identified by Zach's former associate. The facility, ostensibly operating as a storage location for imported handicrafts, contained a sophisticated illegal exotic animal holding operation. Custom-built enclosures housed dozens of protected species, including rare parrots, venomous snakes, small primates, and even a juvenile clouded leopard, all destined for sale to wealthy collectors. A hidden office area contained detailed records of transactions, customer information, and shipping routes, providing investigators with a comprehensive overview of the smuggling network's operations. Most significant for the murder case was the discovery of a notebook in which Zach had listed potential problems, with Monica Akins's name underlined and the notation, "Eric says she's asking questions, handle this," dated January 10th, just 3 days before the murder. When taken into custody, Eric Akins initially remained silent, requesting a lawyer before answering any questions. Zach Thompson, however, quickly attempted to distance himself from the murder, claiming he had nothing to do with what Eric did to his mom, and offering to provide information about the smuggling operation in exchange for leniency. During his preliminary interview, Zach revealed that he had indeed met with Eric shortly before the murder, warning him that Monica's questions were becoming a liability to the operation. "I told him to handle it, to shut her up somehow, but I meant like scare her or something, maybe offer her money to keep quiet," Thompson insisted, his voice shaking as he realized the implications of his words. "I never thought he'd hurt her. I swear I didn't tell him to do that." This statement, while intended as a self-serving attempt to avoid murder charges, provided investigators with crucial evidence of premeditation and conspiracy that would later prove central to the prosecution's case. As the investigation expanded to include the broader wildlife trafficking network, federal agents traced connections between Mendez's operation and similar enterprises in Colombia, Brazil, and Indonesia. Financial records revealed wire transfers totaling millions of dollars, with Eric receiving payments ranging from $500 to $3,000 for his role in caring for the animals and making deliveries to clients. Text messages recovered from Eric's phone documented his growing involvement in the operation, from initially helping with simple tasks like cleaning cages to eventually participating in the smuggling itself, accompanying Zach to private airfields to collect shipments arriving on chartered flights. The messages also revealed Eric's increasing fixation on the money, repeatedly telling friends about his plans to drop out of school once he had saved enough from his business to live like the clients he was serving. Wealthy individuals who appeared to value rare exotic species as status symbols rather than living creatures. By connecting the exotic feather found at the murder scene to the larger criminal enterprise, investigators had not only identified the motive behind Monica Akins's killing, but also uncovered one of the largest wildlife trafficking operations ever discovered in South Florida. What had begun as a domestic homicide investigation had expanded to include federal charges of conspiracy, smuggling endangered species, violations of the Lacey Act, and money laundering, all stemming from a mother's concern about her son's activities and her determination to extricate him from a dangerous situation before it was too late. The blue feather that had caught Detective Davis's attention amidst the blood and chaos of the crime scene had become the thread that, when pulled, unraveled an entire criminal network and led directly to Monica's killer, her own son, who had chosen loyalty to his criminal associates and the allure of easy money over his relationship with his mother, with tragic and irrevocable consequences. With Eric Akins and Zach Thompson in custody, Detective James Davis focused on constructing an airtight case that would connect the exotic feather to both the wildlife smuggling operation and Monica's murder. The forensic evidence was compelling. Blood spatter analysis confirmed that the blue Spix's macaw feather had been present during the attack, with Monica's blood deposited on it in a pattern consistent with high-velocity impact spatter typical of stabbing wounds. DNA testing of the feather's calamus, the hollow base that attaches to the bird's skin, yielded trace amounts of Eric's DNA, suggesting he had handled it recently. Most significantly, microscopic comparison between the feather found at the crime scene and those recovered from Eric's jacket and the crates in the van showed they came from the same individual bird, one of the macaws being transported for illegal sale at the time of the suspect's arrest. The forensic examination of the murder weapon revealed additional connections to the smuggling operation. The chef's knife used to stab Monica had been hastily cleaned, but trace evidence specialists detected minute blood residue in the handle's textured grip and the seam where the blade met the handle. More surprisingly, they also found microscopic blue feather fragments embedded in these same areas, suggesting that Eric had handled the exotic birds shortly before grabbing the knife during the confrontation with his mother. This physical evidence created a direct timeline linking Eric's wildlife trafficking activities to the murder weapon itself. Crime scene reconstruction specialists theorized that Eric likely had feathers on his clothes or hands from handling the birds earlier that day, and when he grabbed the knife in anger, some of these fragments transferred to the weapon, while a whole feather may have fallen from his clothing during the struggle with Monica. Detective Sophia Reyes developed the motive aspect of the case, meticulously documenting Monica's growing awareness of her son's criminal activities through her digital footprint and interviews with her colleagues and friends. Monica's supervisor at Sunset Palms Assisted Living Facility recalled a conversation just 2 days before the murder, during which Monica had appeared distressed and mentioned finding evidence of something illegal involving Eric. She told me she was planning to confront him that week and give him an ultimatum. Either he would cut ties with these people he was involved with, or she would report what she knew to authorities, the supervisor stated in her formal interview. Monica was torn because she wanted to protect her son, but she said she couldn't stand by while he threw his life away on something that could send him to prison. This testimony established Monica's intent to take action that would have jeopardized the entire smuggling operation, providing a clear motive for silencing her. The financial angle of the case proved equally damning for Eric. Forensic accountants traced deposits totaling over $42,000 into various payment apps and cryptocurrency accounts linked to Eric over the 7-month period preceding the murder, an astronomical sum for a high school student with no legitimate employment. Transaction records showed that Eric had made several significant purchases in the weeks leading up to the killing: a $1,200 designer jacket, a $950 gaming console, and most tellingly, a $3,500 down payment on a used sports car that he had arranged to pick up the week after the murder. These expenditures painted a picture of a teenager seduced by the trappings of wealth that his involvement in wildlife trafficking had provided, wealth that his mother's threatened exposure would have ended, along with his freedom if criminal charges had resulted from her reporting the operation to authorities. Trevor Sny's testimony became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case once he had recovered sufficiently to provide a detailed account of what he had witnessed. In a recorded statement taken at his hospital bedside, Trevor described arriving at the Akins home and hearing Eric shouting at Monica from the driveway. He was saying something like, "You'll ruin everything, and do you know how much money I'm making?" Trevor recalled, his bandaged hands resting painfully on the hospital blanket. "When I walked in, I saw Monica on the floor with blood everywhere, and Eric just standing there with the knife, breathing hard and staring at her. When he saw me reach for my phone to call 911, he grabbed the scissors from the counter and came at me saying no one could know what happened." This eyewitness account not only placed Eric at the scene with the murder weapon, but also demonstrated his consciousness of guilt and determination to prevent authorities from learning about the killing, and by extension, the wildlife smuggling operation that had motivated it. The investigation into Zach Thompson's role revealed that he had been actively grooming Eric for months, deliberately targeting the impressionable teenager as a recruit for the smuggling operation. Text messages between the two showed a calculated progression. Zach initially befriended Eric by offering him access to parties, alcohol, and the appearance of an exciting lifestyle, before gradually introducing him to the business opportunity of wildlife trafficking. "These rich people will pay anything for the rarest animals," Zach had written in one message. "All you have to do is help with deliveries and taking care of the merchandise, and you can make more in a weekend than your mom makes in a month." Other messages showed Zach instructing Eric on how to conceal his newfound wealth from his mother, advising him to keep purchases moderate at first and to create cover stories about winning money gambling online or doing web design for cash clients. This evidence established that Eric's involvement wasn't merely a case of a teenager falling in with bad company, but rather a targeted recruitment into an organized criminal enterprise. As investigators dug deeper into the smuggling operation, they uncovered evidence that Monica's suspicions had been initially triggered by seemingly small details that her maternal instinct had recognized as out of place. Her best friend told detectives that Monica had noticed unusual scratches on Eric's arms that didn't match his explanations about bike accidents or catching them on tree branches. Monica was a caregiver. She knew what animal scratches looked like, the friend explained. She told me she thought they looked like claw marks. But Eric got defensive when she questioned him. Other red flags included the strong odor of animal waste and disinfectant on Eric's clothes when he returned from what he claimed were study sessions at friends' houses, and unusual hours when he would receive calls and immediately leave the house, often returning in the early morning hours with no plausible explanation for where he had been. These observations, documented in Monica's journal, and corroborated by text messages she had sent to her sister expressing concern, showed how her growing suspicions had eventually led her to investigate her son's activities more thoroughly. The case against Eric was further strengthened by evidence recovered from his bedroom computer, which forensic technicians had seized during the initial search of the Akins home. Despite attempts to delete incriminating files, data recovery specialists retrieved a trove of photographs documenting Eric's involvement in the smuggling operation. The images showed him handling various exotic species, including the Spix's macaws, inside the Alapata warehouse. Metadata embedded in the digital files provided precise dates and times, creating a timeline of Eric's deepening involvement in wildlife trafficking. Most damning was a series of photos taken just hours before the murder, showing Eric and Zach packaging several exotic birds for transport, birds that matched those later found in the van during their arrest. These images placed Eric in direct contact with the source of the blue feather found at the crime scene immediately before his fatal confrontation with his mother. Detective Davis's interview with Rafael Mendez, the Brazilian businessman at the top of the smuggling operation, yielded additional evidence after prosecutors offered a deal reducing his potential sentence in exchange for testimony against Eric and Zach. Mendez confirmed that Monica Akins had become a serious concern for the organization after Eric mentioned her increasing questions about his activities. Zach told me the boy's mother was becoming suspicious, asking about the animals and where he was getting money, Mendez stated in his deposition. I instructed Zach to handle the situation, to either bring the boy in line or remove him from our operation if he couldn't control his home situation. I never explicitly ordered violence, but I made it clear that we couldn't afford exposure. This testimony established that the threat Monica posed to the smuggling ring had been discussed at the highest levels of the organization, elevating her murder from a spontaneous act of rage to something closer to a calculated elimination of a potential witness, a significant factor in determining the appropriate charges and potential sentence. The psychological component of the case came into focus as investigators interviewed Eric's teachers and school counselors, who described a troubling transformation over the previous year. Once a solid student with a particular aptitude for biology and environmental sciences, Eric had become increasingly disengaged from his education, exhibiting sudden changes in his peer group, style of dress, and attitude toward authority figures. His biology teacher recalled Eric's earlier passion for wildlife conservation, noting the bitter irony that he had once written a research paper on the threats facing endangered bird species. He seemed to genuinely care about these animals and their protection, the teacher told detectives. To think that he later became involved in trafficking the very species he once advocated for shows how completely his values were corrupted. This psychological insight would later be leveraged by prosecutors to counter defense arguments that Eric was merely a misguided teenager who had made a terrible mistake, instead portraying him as someone who had knowingly betrayed not only his mother, but also his own previously held principles for the sake of profit and status. By the time the investigation file was transferred to the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office, detectives had assembled a comprehensive case connecting all the elements of the crime. The exotic blue feather found at the murder scene had led investigators from a domestic homicide to a sophisticated international wildlife smuggling operation, establishing both means and motive for Monica Akins's killing. Physical evidence placed Eric at the scene with the murder weapon. Financial records documented his profit from the criminal enterprise his mother threatened to expose, and witness testimony confirmed his determination to silence those who might reveal his illegal activities. What had begun with Detective Davis's intuitive recognition of the feather's significance had expanded into one of the most complex and far-reaching cases in the department's recent history. A case that would not only seek justice for Monica Akins, but also dismantle a wildlife trafficking network responsible for the exploitation of countless endangered species. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors were confident that the exotic feather had given them precisely what they needed: an unbreakable connection between the tragic murder of a caring mother and the criminal underworld that had seduced her son into becoming her killer. The arrest of Eric Atkins occurred at 2:17 a.m. on January 17, 2022. When tactical officers surrounded the van, he and Zach Thompson were loading with crated exotic animals outside Rafael Mendez's luxury Brickell apartment building. Unlike many murder suspects who resist capture, Eric offered no resistance, slumping against the van as officers secured his hands behind his back with tactical restraints. "Is my mom really dead?" he asked Officer Ramirez during the initial detention, his voice barely audible. When the officer confirmed that Monica Akins had indeed been killed, witnesses reported that Eric closed his eyes and whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," a statement that would later be entered into evidence as a spontaneous admission. The 17-year-old appeared disoriented and exhausted, having apparently not slept properly in the 4 days since the murder. His designer clothes now rumpled and stained, the facade of sophisticated criminal completely collapsed into that of a terrified adolescent facing the consequences of his actions. Eric was transported to Miami-Dade Police Headquarters while crime scene technicians processed the van and its contents, documenting the exotic animals hidden in special compartments and collecting the bloody jacket that would provide crucial physical evidence linking him to his mother's murder. Because of his age, detectives were required to attempt to contact a parent or guardian before questioning Eric, but with his mother dead and his father's whereabouts unknown, they reached his adult sister Elisa, who was still at the hospital with her injured husband, Trevor. The detectives explained the situation, informing her of Eric's arrest for their mother's murder. "I don't want to see him," Elisa responded through tears, her voice hardening with each word. "He killed our mother and tried to kill my husband. He's not my brother anymore." She declined to arrange for an attorney, stating that Eric would have to rely on a public defender, effectively cutting ties with the brother whose actions had shattered their family. Before the formal interrogation could begin, Eric was processed through the department's booking procedures, photographed, fingerprinted, and provided with a standard-issue jumpsuit to replace his clothes, which were taken as evidence. The teenager appeared to be in shock, mechanically following instructions with a blank expression that occasionally gave way to moments of visible despair when the reality of his situation seemed to break through. When informed of his right to have an appropriate adult present during questioning due to his age, Eric declined, stating that there was no one he wanted to call. A court-appointed attorney, Maria Gonzalez from the Public Defender's Office, was summoned to represent him, arriving at the police station at approximately 4:30 a.m. After a private consultation with Eric, during which she presumably advised him of his rights and legal options, Gonzalez informed detectives that her client was willing to make a statement. The interrogation room where Detective James Davis and Detective Sophia Reyes awaited Eric was deliberately sparse, containing only a table, 3 chairs, and a clearly visible recording system. The detectives had prepared thoroughly, organizing their evidence in a strategic sequence designed to break through any denials or alternative narratives Eric might attempt to construct. The 17-year-old entered the room with his attorney, his shoulders hunched and eyes downcast, the swagger evident in his social media photos completely absent. Davis began by formally advising Eric of his Miranda rights and confirming that he understood he was being recorded, before starting with open-ended questions about Eric's relationship with his mother, intentionally avoiding immediate mention of the murder to establish a baseline for Eric's communication style and emotional state. "Eric, we found something interesting at your house," Detective Davis said after the preliminary questions, reaching into an evidence bag and carefully removing the sealed container holding the blue Spix's macaw feather found at the crime scene. He placed it on the table between them, watching as Eric's eyes widened in recognition. "Can you tell me about this feather and how it ended up covered in your mother's blood?" Eric stared at the feather for several long seconds, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid, before looking up at his attorney, who nodded slightly, having already discussed the overwhelming physical evidence against him. "It's from one of the birds," Eric finally whispered, his voice cracking. "The macaws Zach got from Brazil. Last month, I must have had it on my clothes when—" He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence, referring to the moment he had taken his mother's life. Detective Reyes took over questioning, her approach more empathetic than her partner's, focusing on Eric's relationship with Zach Thompson and the progression of his involvement in the smuggling operation. "We know Zach recruited you, Eric. We've seen the text messages where he promised you money, status, an exciting life. Tell us how it started." This strategic pivot away from the murder itself momentarily relieved some of the immediate pressure on Eric, allowing him to begin talking about his introduction to the criminal world that had ultimately led to tragedy. Eric described meeting Zach at a local shopping mall where the older man had approached him, commenting on his sneakers and starting a conversation that seemed coincidental but was later revealed to be a calculated recruitment tactic. "He showed me his car, his watch, his apartment, said I could have all that too if I was smart and willing to work with him," Eric explained, his voice gaining strength as he recounted the early days of what he had perceived as a friendship rather than a criminal conspiracy. As Eric became more comfortable talking, Detective Davis guided the conversation back toward Monica's growing concerns about her son's activities. "Your mother kept records, Eric. She documented her suspicions in her journal, saved screenshots of your social media posts with the exotic animals. She was building a case, wasn't she? Not to get you in trouble, but to save you from what you were becoming involved in." The mention of Monica's efforts to protect him triggered a visible emotional response, with Eric's composure cracking as tears welled in his eyes. "She found photos on my laptop," he admitted, staring at his hands. "Pictures of me handling the macaws at the warehouse. She confronted me that night, said she knew about the smuggling, that these were endangered animals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She said she was going to the authorities the next day if I didn't agree to stop immediately." The key moment in the interrogation came when Detective Reyes placed Monica's phone on the table, displaying the text message she had sent Eric the morning of the murder. "We need to talk when I get home tonight. I know about the animals, Eric. This has to stop before you get into serious trouble." Eric stared at his mother's last message to him, his face crumpling as the full weight of what he had done seemed to settle on him. "Zach told me I had to handle it, that I couldn't let her ruin everything," he said, his voice barely audible. "When she started talking about going to Fish and Wildlife, about how I could still turn things around if I cooperated with authorities, I just saw everything disappearing, the money, the respect, the future I thought I was building. I grabbed the knife without even thinking. I just wanted her to stop talking." Eric's account of the actual murder was fragmented and halting, marked by long pauses and moments where he seemed to dissociate from his own narrative. He described the argument escalating as Monica refused to back down, insisting that she would report the operation not to punish Eric, but to save him from more serious consequences later. "She kept saying she was doing it because she loved me, that she couldn't watch me throw my life away," Eric recalled, wiping tears from his face with the sleeve of his jumpsuit. "But all I could think about was Zach saying that anyone who threatened the operation had to be dealt with, that we couldn't afford loose ends. When she turned to get her phone, saying she was calling her cousin-in-law enforcement, right then, I just... He couldn't complete the sentence, but the detectives understood that this was the moment Monica's fate had been sealed. when her desperate attempt to save her son had instead triggered his fatal action against her. The interrogation took an even darker turn when detectives questioned Eric about the attack on his brother-in-law, Trevor Snye. "Trevor wasn't part of this, Eric. He was just bringing groceries to your mom. Why did you attack him with the scissors?" Detective Davis's tone hardened, the empathy displayed earlier giving way to direct confrontation about this second act of violence. Eric's response revealed the panic and desperation that had driven him after killing Monica. "I heard someone come in the front door. Trevor saw me standing there with the knife, saw Mom on the floor. He started to call 911 and I just reacted. I couldn't let anyone know what happened. I needed time to get away, to contact Zach and figure out what to do next." This admission of a calculated attempt to silence a witness rather than a crime of passion would later significantly impact the charges filed against Eric, supporting the prosecution's argument for premeditation not just in Monica's murder, but in the overall attempt to cover up the crime. Throughout the interrogation, detectives returned repeatedly to the exotic feather as the physical embodiment of the connection between the wildlife smuggling operation and Monica's murder. "This feather connects everything, Eric," Detective Reyes explained, pointing to the sealed evidence container. "It shows you were handling these endangered birds just before killing your mother to prevent her from exposing the operation. It's why we were able to find you so quickly, why we knew to look for Zach and the smuggling network." Eric stared at the feather with a mixture of recognition and despair, seemingly understanding for the first time how a single piece of evidence had unraveled both the criminal enterprise he had joined and his attempt to escape responsibility for his mother's murder. "I never even noticed it falling," he said quietly. "Didn't realize it was there in all the blood." After nearly 3 hours of questioning, Eric Akins provided a full confession, admitting to stabbing his mother during an argument about his involvement in wildlife trafficking and then attacking Trevor Snye to prevent him from calling authorities. At his attorney's guidance, he also provided detailed information about the smuggling operation, including names of clients, suppliers, and the methods used to transport protected species across international borders. In exchange for this cooperation, the prosecutor's office would later agree to consider these contributions during sentencing recommendations, though the severity of the murder charges meant any leniency would be minimal. As the interrogation concluded, Eric asked if he could write a letter to his sister Elisa, a request the detectives granted with the understanding that all correspondence would be reviewed before delivery. "I know sorry doesn't fix anything," Eric said as he was led back to his cell. "But I need her to know I never meant for Mom to die." Following Eric's confession, Detective Davis conducted a separate interrogation of Zach Thompson, who had retained a private attorney and was adamantly attempting to distance himself from Monica's murder while minimizing his role in the wildlife trafficking operation. Unlike Eric's emotional breakdown, Zach presented as calculating and self-interested, offering to provide information about Rafael Mendez and the international suppliers in exchange for reduced charges. When confronted with the text messages instructing Eric to handle his mother's threats to expose the operation, Zach claimed these had been misinterpreted. "I meant he should talk to her, maybe offer her some money to keep quiet," Thompson insisted, leaning forward intently. "I never told him to hurt her. That was all him. He's always been unstable, too emotional for this business." This attempt to portray Eric as solely responsible for escalating to violence contradicted the evidence investigators had gathered about Zach's systematic grooming and manipulation of the teenager, including explicit instructions on dealing with problems and loose ends. The interrogations of both suspects yielded a comprehensive picture of the events leading to Monica Akins's murder. The exotic feather that had first caught Detective Davis's attention had indeed been the thread that connected a domestic homicide to an international wildlife trafficking operation. As Eric Akins was led to a holding cell to await his first court appearance, the 17-year-old bore little resemblance to the confident, smirking figure in his social media posts, posing with exotic animals and expensive accessories. With his designer clothes replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit and his carefully styled hair now disheveled, he appeared every bit the frightened teenager he was, one who had been seduced by the promise of easy money and status into a criminal world he wasn't equipped to navigate, and who had made the irrevocable decision to silence his own mother when she threatened to pull him back from the brink. The Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office announced the following day that Eric Akins would be charged as an adult with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to traffic endangered species, among other charges. The decision to prosecute him as an adult rather than in the juvenile system reflected both the severity of the crimes and the calculated nature of the attack on Trevor Snye after Monica's murder. As Eric awaited arraignment in a secure juvenile holding facility separated from the adult jail population, the investigation into the wildlife trafficking network continued to expand, with federal agencies using information from his confession to identify and arrest additional members of the smuggling operation across 3 countries. The exotic blue feather that had fallen unnoticed during a moment of domestic violence had ultimately exposed not just a murder, but an entire criminal ecosystem, proving once again that in homicide investigations, the smallest, most seemingly insignificant piece of evidence can sometimes break the biggest cases. On a sweltering Monday morning in July 2022, 6 months after Monica Akins's brutal murder, the imposing neoclassical facade of the Miami-Dade County Courthouse cast long shadows across the throng of reporters and spectators gathered for the opening of what local media had dubbed the Macaw murder trial. Inside courtroom 3B, on the building's 4th floor, the air conditioning strained against the Florida heat as bailiffs escorted 17-year-old Eric Akins to the defense table, the teenager's thin frame nearly lost in the oversized charcoal suit his public defender had provided for court appearances. The once cocky expression familiar from his social media photos had been replaced by a hollow-eyed stare, his 7 months in juvenile detention having stripped away any remnant of the brash persona he had cultivated during his time in the smuggling operation. Seated at the prosecution table, Catherine Campbell arranged her meticulously prepared notes while occasionally glancing toward the gallery where Trevor Snye sat beside his wife Elisa, both of them deliberately avoiding looking at the brother-in-law who had nearly ended Trevor's life after taking his mother's. Judge Raymond Ortiz called the court to order precisely at 9 a.m., his reputation for punctuality and no-nonsense courtroom management setting an immediate tone of gravity for the proceedings. After addressing preliminary matters and confirming both sides were ready to proceed, he instructed the prosecution to present its opening statement. Catherine Campbell, a veteran prosecutor with 15 years of experience handling complex homicide cases, approached the jury box with measured steps, making deliberate eye contact with each of the 12 jurors who would ultimately decide Eric's fate. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and authoritative, "this case begins with a feather, not just any feather, but one from among the rarest birds on earth, a Spix's macaw worth over $200,000 on the black market and protected by both national and international law." She held up an evidence bag containing the preserved blue feather, its vivid color still visible through the transparent material, now forever linked to the violent end of Monica Akins's life. Campbell wove a compelling narrative that connected the exotic feather directly to Monica's murder and Eric's involvement in the wildlife trafficking ring that had provided the motive for silencing his mother. The evidence will show that when Monica Akins discovered her son's participation in an international smuggling operation trading in endangered species, she did what any loving mother would do. She confronted him, intending to save him from a path that would destroy his future, the prosecutor explained, pacing slowly before the jury. But instead of accepting his mother's intervention, instead of allowing her to help him extract himself from this criminal enterprise, Eric Akins made a calculated decision to permanently silence the one person who threatened to expose his illegal activities. Campbell methodically outlined how the investigation had unfolded, emphasizing how the distinctive blue feather had been the crucial piece of evidence that connected the domestic murder scene to the larger criminal conspiracy, establishing both opportunity and motive for the killing. The prosecutor didn't shy away from the brutality of Monica's murder, describing in clinical detail the 17 stab wounds she had suffered and the defensive injuries that showed she had fought desperately for her life as her own son attacked her. Monica Akins died trying to protect her son from himself, Campbell stated, her voice dropping to emphasize the tragedy. And when Trevor Snye walked in on the aftermath and attempted to call for help, Eric attacked him too, using scissors to inflict wounds that have left permanent damage to Mr. Snye's hands he needs for his livelihood as a delivery driver. Several jurors visibly recoiled as Campbell displayed crime scene photographs showing the blood-spattered kitchen and Monica's body, while others glanced toward Trevor, who sat with his still visibly damaged hands clasped tightly in his lap, his wife's arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders. The prosecutor concluded by directly addressing the defense's anticipated strategy. You may hear claims that Eric was manipulated, that he was just a child led astray by older criminals, but the evidence will show that Eric Akins made a series of deliberate choices to join a criminal enterprise, to silence his mother when she threatened to expose him, and to attack his brother-in-law to cover his crimes. These were not the impulsive actions of a confused child, but the calculated decisions of someone who chose profit and status over family and morality. Defense attorney Maria Gonzalez presented a starkly different narrative in her opening statement, portraying Eric as a vulnerable teenager who had been systematically groomed and manipulated by sophisticated adult criminals, particularly Zach Thompson. Eric Akins was 16 years old when Zach Thompson first approached him at Dolphin Mall, identifying him as an ideal recruit for their operation, young, impressionable, and hungry for the respect and status he saw others enjoying, Gonzalez explained, her tone compassionate yet firm. What followed was a textbook case of criminal grooming, isolating Eric from positive influences, gradually introducing him to illegal activities, and creating an environment where loyalty to the criminal enterprise superseded all other relationships and values. The defense attorney acknowledged the horror of Monica's death, but characterized it as the tragic culmination of psychological manipulation rather than a calculated murder, describing the killing as a moment of panic and confusion when Eric's artificially constructed criminal world collided with his mother's desperate attempt to save him. Gonzalez directly addressed the exotic feather that had become central to the prosecution's case, attempting to reframe its significance. The prosecution is right about one thing. This case does begin with a feather, she conceded, gesturing toward the evidence bag Campbell had displayed. But that feather represents something different than what Ms. Campbell suggests. It represents how thoroughly Eric had been immersed in a criminal world orchestrated by adults who knew exactly how to manipulate a teenager's developing brain, his natural desire for acceptance, and his psychological vulnerabilities. The defense attorney emphasized Eric's previous clean record, his earlier interest in wildlife conservation, and the systematic way Zach Thompson had targeted him specifically because of his age and malleability. Eric Akins is responsible for his actions, Gonzalez concluded, placing her hand briefly on her client's shoulder. But this tragedy was engineered by the adults who deliberately corrupted a child for their profit, who taught him that violence was an acceptable solution to problems, and who abandoned him to face the consequences alone when their criminal scheme unraveled. Following opening statements, the prosecution began presenting its case with testimony from first responders who had arrived at the Aquins home on the night of January 13th. Officer Miguel Rodriguez described the scene he and his partner had encountered, including the blood trail leading to the neighbor's house, where Trevor had collapsed, and the discovery of Monica's body in the kitchen. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, the floor, even spatter reaching the ceiling, Rodriguez testified, his professional demeanor occasionally slipping to reveal the emotional impact the scene had made even on an experienced officer. The victim was lying face up near the refrigerator with multiple stab wounds visible on her torso and neck. A kitchen knife was in the sink, appearing to have been hastily rinsed but still bearing visible blood residue on the handle. The officer's testimony established the crime scene basics while laying the groundwork for later expert testimony regarding blood spatter patterns and the positioning of the exotic feather within this context of violence. The prosecution's strategy became clearer as Catherine Campbell called Dr. Lydia Patel, the medical examiner who had performed Monica's autopsy. Using anatomical diagrams, rather than the more graphic autopsy photographs, a tactical decision to avoid unnecessarily alienating jurors, Dr. Patel methodically walked through each of the 17 stab wounds Monica had sustained, identifying the fatal injury to her carotid artery that had led to rapid blood loss and death. The pattern and depth of the wounds indicate considerable force was used, Dr. Patel explained, her clinical tone belying the brutality she was describing. The defensive wounds on her hands and forearms show the victim was conscious and actively trying to protect herself during the attack. When Campbell asked about the relative positions of the attacker and victim, Dr. Patel indicated that the wound angles suggested the attacker was slightly shorter than Monica, consistent with 17-year-old Eric's height. This testimony established not only the cause of death, but also supported the prosecution's narrative of a sustained, determined attack, rather than a single, impulsive action. The courtroom atmosphere grew tense when Trevor Snye took the stand, his hands still bearing visible scars from the scissor attack 6 months earlier. Trevor described arriving at Monica's house to deliver groceries and hearing raised voices from inside. I could hear Eric shouting something like, "You'll ruin everything," and Monica trying to calm him down, Trevor testified, his voice steady despite the evident emotional toll of recounting the events. When I walked in, Monica was already on the floor, and there was blood everywhere. Eric was standing over her with the knife, just staring down at her. When he saw me, there was this moment where we just looked at each other, and then I reached for my phone to call 911. Trevor's voice faltered as he described how Eric had lunged at him with scissors taken from a nearby counter, stabbing repeatedly at his hands as he tried to protect himself while dialing emergency services. He kept saying, no one can know," over and over while he was attacking me. I managed to hit him with my elbow and run out the door to the neighbors, but I could barely feel my hands by then. There was so much blood. During cross-examination, defense attorney Gonzalez treated Trevor with respect, but attempted to introduce elements that supported the narrative of Eric being manipulated by Zach Thompson. Mr. Snye, in the months before this terrible incident, did Monica ever express concern to you about Eric's new friendship with Zach Thompson, she asked. Trevor nodded, explaining that Monica had indeed been worried about Zach's influence, describing him as too old to be hanging around a teenager, and noting that Eric's personality had changed dramatically since their friendship began. This testimony, while damaging to Eric in confirming Monica's awareness of his criminal activities, also supported the defense's argument that he had been deliberately targeted and groomed by an older criminal. Gonzalez carefully avoided questions that might appear to blame Monica or diminish the horror of what Trevor had experienced, recognizing that any perceived attack on either victim would likely backfire with the jury. The scientific foundation of the prosecution's case was established when Professor Elena Vasquez took the stand as an expert witness on endangered bird species. The ornithologist explained the extreme rarity of Spix's macaws, with fewer than 160 individuals existing worldwide, all in captivity. These birds are functionally extinct in the wild, Professor Vasquez testified, displaying photos of the brilliant blue parrots alongside the feather found at the crime scene. Each individual bird is irreplaceable from a conservation perspective, and their distinctive blue feathers are immediately recognizable to experts. The professor confirmed that the feather found in Monica's blood at the murder scene was unquestionably from a Spix's macaw, and that possession of such a bird, or even parts of it, without proper authorization would constitute a serious federal offense. This testimony established the significant legal jeopardy Monica's discovery had represented for the smuggling operation, strengthening the prosecution's argument regarding Eric's motive for silencing his mother. The most dramatic moment of the trial's opening day came when Campbell called FBI forensic analyst Dr. Marcus Chen to testify about the blood evidence found on the exotic feather. Using enlarged microscopic images displayed on screens visible to the jury, Dr. Chen explained how the blood spatter pattern on the feather was consistent with high-velocity impact spatter typically seen in stabbing attacks. The size, shape, and distribution of these blood droplets indicate the feather was present during the actual stabbing, not transferred to the scene afterward, Dr. Chen testified, pointing to specific features in the images. Furthermore, DNA analysis confirms the blood on the feather belongs to Monica Atkins, while trace DNA extracted from the calamus, the hollow base of the feather, matches the defendant, Eric Atkins. This scientific evidence directly connected Eric to both the exotic birds and the murder scene, making it impossible for the defense to argue he hadn't been present during the attack or handling the protected species. As the first day of trial concluded, Judge Ortiz instructed the jury to avoid media coverage of the case and not to discuss the proceedings with anyone. The 12 jurors filed out, many looking visibly affected by the testimony and evidence presented. Eric Atkins was led back to the holding cell by bailiffs, his shoulders slumped and gaze fixed on the floor, the weight of the prosecution's opening salvo evident in his demeanor. In the gallery, Elisa comforted her husband Trevor, both of them deliberately turning away as Eric passed by, the family bonds that had once connected them now irreparably severed by violence. Outside the courthouse, reporters speculated about the defense's ability to counter the powerful physical evidence connecting the exotic feather to both the wildlife trafficking operation and Monica's murder, while legal analysts noted that the prosecution had effectively established both means and motive on the very first day of what promised to be a challenging and emotionally charged trial. The exotic blue feather, once attached to one of the world's rarest birds, then carried unwittingly into a family home on the clothing of a teenager caught between criminal ambition and his mother's desperate intervention, had now become the central focus of a murder trial that would determine whether Eric Atkins would spend most or all of his remaining life behind bars. As Catherine Campbell carefully packed her notes at the prosecution table, she glanced at the evidence bag containing the feather, reflecting on the strange irony that this delicate object from a critically endangered species had survived to bear witness to another kind of extinction, the destruction of a family and the effective end of a young man's free life before it had truly begun. The blue feather's journey from the wing of a rare macaw to a blood-stained kitchen floor to an evidence bag in a Miami courtroom served as a poignant reminder of how seemingly small, fragile things could sometimes carry the greatest weight in determining the course of justice. On the fifth day of trial, the courtroom fell silent as Catherine Campbell called Dr. Alejandro Morales, curator of ornithology at the Miami Museum of Natural Science and one of the world's leading experts on endangered parrot species. The distinguished scientist approached the witness stand carrying a leather portfolio containing reference materials, his demeanor reflecting the gravity of both the criminal proceedings and the conservation issues at stake. After establishing Dr. Morales's credentials, including 3 decades of field research in Brazil and participation in International Spix's macaw recovery programs, Campbell handed him the evidence bag containing the blue feather found at the murder scene. "Dr. Morales, can you identify this feather for the court?" she asked, as bailiffs distributed enlarged photographs of the feather to the jury. The ornithologist carefully examined the evidence without opening the sealed bag, then looked up with absolute certainty in his expression. "This is a primary flight feather from the left wing of an adult Spix's macaw, Cyanopsida spixii," he stated definitively. "The distinctive cobalt blue coloration, size, shape, and specific patterning at the vein are unmistakable to specialists in psittacine taxonomy." Campbell guided Dr. Morales through testimony explaining the extreme rarity of Spix's macaws, establishing for the jury the exceptional nature of finding such a feather in a Miami home. In 2022, there are only approximately 160 of these birds left on the planet, all in captivity, Dr. Morales explained, displaying a chart showing the species' precipitous decline. The last confirmed sighting of a wild Spix's macaw was in 2000 in northeastern Brazil, and the species has since been declared extinct in the wild. The ornithologist detailed the strictly controlled international breeding program for these birds, emphasizing that every legitimate specimen was accounted for in registered facilities around the world. Each bird has DNA records, microchips, and documentation filed with international conservation authorities, he testified. There is absolutely no legal way for a private individual in the United States to possess a Spix's macaw or even a feather from one without extensive permits, which are rarely granted outside of accredited scientific or zoological institutions. The expert witness then addressed the black market value of the birds, providing crucial context for the jury's understanding of the smuggling operation's economics. A single Spix's macaw can command upwards of $200,000 on the illegal wildlife market, Dr. Morales stated, causing several jurors to visibly react to the figure. For private collectors seeking status symbols, the rarer the species, the more desirable it becomes, creating a perverse incentive where the closer a species is to extinction, the more valuable it becomes to wildlife traffickers. The ornithologist explained how such trafficking undermines conservation efforts and international agreements designed to protect endangered species, effectively placing these birds in double jeopardy, threatened by both habitat loss in their native range and the illegal capture of remaining individuals for black market sales. This testimony established not only the significant monetary value of the smuggling operation Eric had participated in, but also the broader ecological harm caused by such activities, highlighting the serious nature of the crimes Monica had discovered her son committing. When defense attorney Maria Gonzalez cross-examined Dr. Morales, she focused not on challenging his identification of the feather, but on using his expertise to support the narrative that Eric had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminals. Dr. Morales, in your experience with wildlife trafficking cases, would a typical 17-year-old have the connections, resources, or knowledge to independently access Spix's macaws or other highly endangered species, she asked. The ornithologist acknowledged that sophisticated wildlife smuggling operations typically involved international networks with adult organizers who had established smuggling routes and black market connections. These operations generally have a hierarchical structure, Dr. Morales explained, with those handling the animals at the destination often being lower-level participants rather than the masterminds. This testimony potentially supported the defense's portrayal of Eric as a manipulated teenager rather than a criminal mastermind, though it did little to counter the physical evidence connecting him directly to his mother's murder. The prosecution's case gained further scientific support when forensic blood spatter analyst Terrence Washington took the stand, using detailed visual aids to explain how the blood pattern on the exotic feather proved it was present during Monica's stabbing. The high-velocity impact spatter on this feather is consistent with blood droplets created during a stabbing attack, Washington testified, using laser pointers to identify specific patterns on enlarged photographs. Based on the distribution, size, and directionality of these droplets, I can state with scientific certainty that this feather was within approximately 3 feet of Monica Akins when she received at least one of the stab wounds to her torso. The analyst further explained that microscopic examination showed the blood had impacted the feather from multiple angles, suggesting it was on the attacker's clothing and moved with them throughout the assault, rather than simply lying stationary on a nearby surface. This testimony directly placed the exotic feather, and by extension, Eric, at the immediate scene of violence, contradicting any potential defense claims that he hadn't been present for his mother's stabbing. The connection between the wildlife smuggling operation and Monica's murder was solidified when Detective James Davis returned to the stand to describe the evidence found in Rafael Mendez's apartment and the Alapata warehouse. We recovered 2 live Spix's macaws from hidden compartments in the van Eric Akins and Zach Thompson were loading when arrested, Davis testified, displaying photographs of the seized birds being examined by fish and wildlife veterinarians. Feather samples from these birds were sent to the FBI laboratory, where DNA analysis confirmed that the feather found in Monica Akins's blood came from one of these specific macaws. The detective then presented documentation found in the warehouse office, including a ledger showing payments to various individuals identified only by initials. EA appears repeatedly in these records, Davis explained, pointing to entries highlighted on the projected image, receiving payments ranging from $500 to $3,000 for what are described as handling and delivery services. The final entry for EA is dated January 12, 2022, the day before Monica Akins's murder. In perhaps the most emotionally impactful testimony, Monica's supervisor from Sunset Palms Assisted Living Facility, Ellen Merritt, took the stand to describe Monica's growing concerns about her son's activities in the weeks before her death. Monica came to my office in tears about 2 weeks before she was killed, Ellen recalled, her voice wavering slightly. She showed me photos she'd found on Eric's laptop of him handling exotic birds and reptiles. She recognized some of the animals from conservation programs she'd seen on television and was worried they might be endangered or illegally imported. Ellen described how Monica had researched wildlife trafficking and gradually pieced together that her son was involved in something both illegal and potentially dangerous. The last conversation we had, 2 days before she died, Monica told me she was planning to confront Eric and give him an ultimatum. Either he cut ties with these people he was involved with, or she would report what she knew to authorities. She said, "I'd rather visit my son in juvenile detention than identify his body in a morgue." This testimony established Monica's intent to take action that threatened the smuggling operation, providing clear motive for her murder. The prosecutor systematically connected the physical evidence to Eric's financial motives by calling forensic accountant Lisa Chang to analyze the teenager's spending patterns and unexplained income. In the 7 months preceding Monica Akins's murder, Eric Akins received deposits totaling $42,367 through various payment apps and cryptocurrency accounts, Chang testified, displaying a detailed financial timeline. During this same period, he made purchases inconsistent with a high school student's normal spending patterns, including designer clothing, expensive electronics, and a $3,500 down payment on a sports car scheduled to be delivered the week after the murder. Chang noted that these transactions began appearing shortly after Eric's first documented meeting with Zach Thompson and increased in both frequency and amount as his involvement in the smuggling operation deepened. This financial evidence established Eric's growing reliance on criminal income, strengthening the prosecution's argument that he had killed his mother to protect not just his freedom, but also his newfound wealth and lifestyle. Defense attorney Gonzalez attempted to counter the prosecution's narrative by calling Dr. Patricia Winters, an adolescent psychologist specializing in teenage vulnerability to criminal recruitment. Dr. Winters explained the neurobiological realities of the teenage brain, particularly how the still-developing prefrontal cortex affects decision-making, risk assessment, and impulse control. Adolescents are especially vulnerable to manipulation by adult influences because their brains are still developing the capacity for fully rational decision-making, Dr. Winters testified. They're more susceptible to peer pressure, more focused on immediate rewards rather than long-term consequences, and particularly responsive to social approval or status. The psychologist described how criminal organizations often deliberately target teenagers for these very reasons, exploiting their developmental vulnerabilities and gradually normalizing criminal behavior through a process of incremental involvement. While this testimony provided context for understanding how Eric might have been drawn into the smuggling operation, it faced significant challenges during cross-examination when Campbell forced Dr. Winters to acknowledge that understanding these vulnerabilities did not negate criminal responsibility, particularly for violent acts like murder. The defense case gained some ground when Zach Thompson's former roommate Marcus Diaz testified about witnessing Zach's deliberate recruitment and manipulation of Eric. Zach specifically talked about finding young talent who could be molded, Diaz recalled, describing conversations where Thompson had boasted about his technique for recruiting teenagers. He would scout at malls, looking for kids who seemed impressed by his car or clothes, then gradually bring them in by showing them cash and promising them they could have the same lifestyle. Diaz described how Zach would use a combination of flattery, artificial scarcity, this opportunity won't last, and creation of indebtedness to bind young recruits to the operation, deliberately isolating them from positive influences while fostering dependence on him for approval and rewards. This testimony supported the defense narrative of Eric as a victim of sophisticated manipulation, though Catherine Campbell's cross-examination quickly established that Diaz had his own criminal record and potential motives to shift blame away from his former friend Zach. The most anticipated testimony came when the prosecution called Rafael Mendes, the Brazilian businessman who had directed the wildlife trafficking operation, to the stand. Mendes had accepted a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against both Eric and Zach, receiving a reduced sentence for his cooperation. Impeccably dressed despite his incarceration, and speaking with the confident manner of someone accustomed to authority, Mendes described the structure of the smuggling network he had established after relocating from Brazil. "We needed different levels of personnel," Mendes explained, his accent becoming more pronounced when discussing technical aspects of the operation. Suppliers in South America, transporters who could move the animals through customs using private channels, and then handlers and dealers on the U.S. side. He confirmed that Zach Thompson had been his primary recruiter and middle manager, responsible for finding young people who could handle the animals and make deliveries to clients while attracting minimal suspicion from authorities. Mendes's testimony directly implicated Eric as a willing participant who had progressed from minor involvement to increasingly significant roles in the operation. Thompson reported that Eric was particularly useful because he had a genuine interest in the animals and handled them competently, Mendes stated, his clinical tone devoid of emotion despite the seriousness of his admissions. He was promoted from simply feeding and maintaining the animals to actually conducting transactions with clients, which required significant trust. When Campbell asked about Monica's threat to expose the operation, Mendez confirmed that Zach had informed him about the problem in early January 2022. I instructed Thompson to handle the situation, to either ensure the boy's compliance and discretion or remove him from our operation if he couldn't control his home situation, Mendez testified. I never explicitly ordered violence, but in our business, everyone understands that exposure threatens the entire network. Problems must be eliminated one way or another. This testimony established that Monica's intent to report the smuggling had been discussed at the highest levels of the organization, creating a clear motive for silencing her that went beyond Eric's personal panic. The defense attempted to mitigate Mendez's damaging testimony through cross-examination that emphasized the power imbalance between the sophisticated adult criminal and the teenage recruit. Mr. Mendez, you deliberately structured your operation to insulate yourself from legal consequences by using younger, more vulnerable individuals to conduct the riskiest activities, correct? Gonzalez asked pointedly. Mendez's affirmative response supported the defense's portrayal of Eric as a manipulated pawn rather than an equal participant in the criminal enterprise. However, this narrative suffered a significant blow when Campbell returned for redirect examination and asked Mendez about Eric's response after the murder. When Thompson informed me that Eric had permanently solved the problem with his mother, was Eric seeking to leave the organization out of remorse or regret? Campbell asked. No, Mendez replied matter-of-factly. He requested additional assignments to earn money for leaving the country. He expressed no remorse about his mother, only concern about evading authorities. This testimony severely undermined the defense's portrayal of Eric as a confused, manipulated teenager who had acted in momentary panic rather than with calculated self-interest. The scientific and testimonial evidence concerning the exotic feather found in Monica's blood created an unbreakable chain connecting Eric to both the wildlife smuggling operation and his mother's murder. The feather itself became a powerful symbol for the jury, a rare, beautiful object from an endangered species now forever stained with the blood of a mother killed by her own son when she threatened to expose his participation in the very trade threatening these birds' existence. As both sides prepared for closing arguments, the prosecution had established a compelling narrative, supported by physical evidence, expert testimony, financial records, and witness accounts, all revolving around the blue feather that had fallen unnoticed during a moment of domestic violence, but had ultimately exposed both a murder and a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The defense, while providing context for understanding how Eric had become involved in wildlife trafficking, had struggled to counter the fundamental reality established by the scientific evidence that Eric Akins had deliberately killed his mother to prevent her from exposing his criminal activities, forever staining his hands with the same blood that had marked the exotic blue feather found beneath her body. After 7 days of testimony, mountains of evidence, and emotional witness accounts, the time came for closing arguments in the case against Eric Akins. The courtroom was filled to capacity as spectators, journalists, and family members gathered to witness the culmination of a trial that had captured public attention throughout Miami and beyond. Judge Raymond Ortiz instructed both attorneys to focus their final statements on the evidence presented rather than emotional appeals, a directive that reflected his consistent emphasis on legal procedure throughout the proceedings. As Catherine Campbell approached the jury box for her closing argument, she carried the now infamous evidence bag containing the blue Spix's macaw feather, holding it up as both a literal and symbolic representation of the case she had meticulously constructed against the defendant. "This feather tells a story," Campbell began, her voice measured but intense as she addressed the jury directly. "It tells the story of how 17-year-old Eric Akins chose money and status over his mother's life when she threatened to expose his participation in an exotic animal smuggling operation. This single feather, rare and valuable, covered in Monica Atkins' blood and bearing traces of her son's DNA, connects every aspect of this case: the murder weapon, the motive, and the defendant himself. The prosecutor methodically recapped the evidence presented throughout the trial, emphasizing the scientific testimony that had established the feather's presence during the actual stabbing, the financial records showing Eric's growing dependence on illegal income, and the witness accounts of Monica's intent to report the smuggling operation if her son didn't extract himself from it voluntarily. Campbell reminded the jury of Trevor Sny's testimony about the attack he had suffered when attempting to call 911, highlighting Eric's calculated decision to silence a witness rather than a momentary loss of control. The defense has asked you to view Eric Akins as a victim of manipulation, a child led astray by sophisticated adult criminals, Campbell acknowledged, directly addressing the narrative Maria Gonzalez had presented throughout the trial. And yes, the evidence shows that Zach Thompson deliberately recruited Eric, that Rafael Mendez structured his operation to insulate himself by using younger participants for the riskiest activities. But being manipulated into joining a criminal enterprise does not absolve one of responsibility for murder. The prosecutor moved closer to the jury, her expression somber as she continued. When Monica Akins confronted her son about his illegal activities, offering him a chance to extricate himself before facing serious consequences, Eric had a choice. He could have accepted his mother's help, could have cooperated with authorities to build a case against the true ringleaders of the smuggling operation. Instead, he chose to pick up a knife and stab his mother 17 times to silence her permanently and protect his newfound wealth and status. Campbell concluded by returning to the exotic feather that had become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. This feather represents both the crime Eric committed and the reason he committed it, she stated, holding the evidence bag up one final time. It fell from his clothing during the violent struggle with his mother, a silent witness to her murder. Like the endangered bird it came from, Monica Atkins had no chance against the predatory forces that ultimately took her life. The evidence is clear and unambiguous. Eric Akins murdered his mother to prevent her from exposing his criminal activities, then attacked his brother-in-law to cover up his crime. The prosecution asks you to deliver the only verdict consistent with this evidence: guilty on all counts. With that, Campbell returned to her seat, leaving the jury with the powerful image of the blue feather stained with a mother's blood. Defense attorney Maria Gonzalez approached the jury with a different energy, her demeanor reflective and measured as she prepared to present her final argument for contextualizing, if not excusing, Eric's actions. "The prosecution is correct about one thing," Gonzalez began, surprising some observers with her concession. This case does indeed revolve around this exotic feather. But what this feather truly represents is how thoroughly a 16-year-old boy was immersed in a criminal world engineered by adults who deliberately targeted him because of his youth and vulnerability. Rather than directly challenging the physical evidence linking Eric to Monica's murder, Gonzalez focused on creating a framework for understanding how an otherwise ordinary teenager could become capable of such violence, emphasizing the neurobiological evidence presented by Dr. Winters about adolescent brain development and decision-making capacity. Eric Akins did not wake up one morning and decide to become involved in wildlife trafficking or to harm his mother, Gonzalez continued, moving closer to where Eric sat, slumped at the defense table. He was systematically groomed and manipulated by Zach Thompson, who targeted him, specifically because teenagers are more susceptible to influence, more responsive to immediate rewards, and less capable of fully assessing long-term consequences. Thompson isolated Eric from positive influences, gradually normalized criminal behavior, and created a distorted reality where loyalty to the criminal enterprise superseded all other relationships, including the bond between mother and son. The defense attorney reminded jurors of Marcus Diaz's testimony about Thompson's deliberate recruitment tactics and Rafael Mendez's admission that the operation was structured to exploit younger participants, placing them at greatest legal risk, while the adult organizers remained insulated from direct involvement in the riskiest activities. Gonzalez addressed the tragic moment of Monica's murder directly, acknowledging the horror of the crime while placing it within the context she had established. When Monica Akins discovered her son's involvement and threatened to report the smuggling operation, Eric faced what his manipulated mind perceived as an impossible choice: betray the criminal hierarchy that had become his primary social structure and source of identity, or silence the threat to that structure, she explained. His decision was terrible, tragic, and wrong, but it was made by a teenage brain that had been systematically rewired through months of manipulation, where normal moral constraints had been gradually eroded and replaced with the distorted values of the criminal enterprise. The defense attorney emphasized that understanding these factors didn't eliminate Eric's responsibility, but should inform the jury's assessment of his culpability and intent, particularly regarding the distinction between premeditated murder and a panic-driven reaction to a perceived threat to his newfound identity and status. As you deliberate, Gonzalez concluded, her voice softening as she addressed the jury one final time, I ask you to consider not just what happened on January 13th, 2022, but how it came to happen, how a teenager with no prior criminal history became capable of such violence through systematic exploitation of his developmental vulnerabilities by adult criminals who recognized and targeted those very vulnerabilities. Eric Akins is responsible for his actions, but those actions occurred within a context deliberately engineered by others who bear significant moral, if not legal, responsibility for creating the conditions that made this tragedy possible. With this final appeal for contextual understanding, Gonzalez returned to the defense table, placing a supportive hand briefly on Eric's shoulder as she passed. Judge Ortiz delivered detailed instructions to the jury regarding the legal standards they must apply in their deliberations, explaining the elements of each charge and the burden of proof required for conviction. He emphasized that emotional responses to the crime's brutality should not override their obligation to assess the evidence objectively, nor should sympathy for the defendant's youth influence their application of the law to the facts presented. After these instructions, the 12 jurors were escorted to the deliberation room at 3:17 p.m., taking with them the weight of determining the fate of a 17-year-old who had admitted to killing his mother, but whose degree of criminal culpability remained for them to decide. As the courtroom emptied, Eric was led back to a holding cell to await the verdict, his expression vacant as he shuffled between the bailiffs who flanked him. The deliberations proved shorter than many legal observers had anticipated, given the complexity of the case and the competing narratives presented by the prosecution and defense. At 7:38 p.m., after just 4 hours and 21 minutes of discussion, the jury notified the court that they had reached a unanimous verdict on all counts. As word spread, spectators and journalists rushed back into the courtroom, and the principals were summoned to hear the jury's decision. Eric Akins was brought back to the defense table, appearing even more diminished than he had during the trial, his shoulders hunched and eyes downcast as he awaited the pronouncement that would determine the course of his remaining life. In the gallery, Elisa and Trevor Snye sat holding hands, their expressions tense with the emotional weight of the moment, while several rows behind them, a group of Monica's colleagues from Sunset Palms wore matching memorial pins bearing her photograph. The jury foreperson, a middle-aged elementary school teacher, stood as Judge Ortiz asked for their verdict. On the count of murder in the first degree of Monica Akins, we find the defendant, Eric Akins, guilty, she announced. her voice clear and unwavering despite the gravity of the moment. Similar pronouncements followed for each additional count: guilty of attempted murder of Trevor Snye, guilty of conspiracy to traffic endangered species, guilty of obstruction of justice. As each verdict was read, Eric remained motionless, showing no visible reaction to the pronouncements that effectively ended any possibility of freedom for the foreseeable future. The only indication that he registered the impact of the jury's decision came when the judge thanked the jurors for their service, a single tear tracking silently down Eric's cheek as the full weight of his circumstances finally seemed to penetrate the emotional numbness that had characterized his demeanor throughout the trial. The reaction in the courtroom reflected the complex emotions surrounding the case. In the gallery, Elisa buried her face against her husband's shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs that contained no joy or satisfaction despite the justice delivered for her mother and husband. Trevor wrapped his still-healing hand around his wife, his expression grim rather than triumphant. The verdicts bringing legal closure, but no remedy for the family devastation Eric's actions had caused. Monica's colleagues from Sunset Palms embraced each other, several wiping away tears as they recognized that while the legal system had functioned as intended, nothing could restore the vibrant, caring woman whose life had been cut short. Even Catherine Campbell, who had secured a complete victory for the prosecution, maintained a somber demeanor as she gathered her materials, the weight of the human tragedy underlying the case evident in her deliberate movements and subdued acknowledgement of congratulations from colleagues. Outside the courthouse, a cluster of reporters awaited statements from the attorneys, their cameras and microphones creating a gauntlet through which the trial participants would need to pass. Catherine Campbell delivered a brief, measured statement focused on justice rather than triumph. Today's verdict reflects the overwhelming evidence of Eric Akins's guilt in the murder of his mother, Monica, and the attempted murder of his brother-in-law, Trevor Snye. While no legal outcome can heal the wounds this crime has inflicted on the family and community, we hope this verdict provides some measure of closure and reaffirms that our justice system can hold accountable those who commit even the most devastating acts of violence, regardless of their age or circumstances. The prosecutor declined to answer specific questions, emphasizing respect for the family's privacy during this difficult time and acknowledging the inherent tragedy of a case involving a teenage defendant and the murder of his own mother. Maria Gonzalez, visibly disappointed but professional, addressed the waiting media with a statement that reflected her continued commitment to her client, despite the adverse verdict. While we respect the jury's decision, we believe there were significant mitigating factors regarding Eric's age, the manipulation he experienced, and the neurobiological realities of adolescent decision-making that should have been given greater weight. We intend to explore all available avenues for appeal and will continue advocating for appropriate consideration of these factors during sentencing. The defense attorney emphasized that her comments should not be interpreted as minimizing the tragedy of Monica's death or the trauma experienced by Trevor Snye, but rather as an acknowledgement of the complex realities surrounding teenage criminal behavior and the influence of adult manipulation on developing minds. Perhaps the most poignant reaction came from Elisa, who had declined to speak publicly throughout the trial, but chose to make a brief statement after the verdict, standing alongside Trevor with their hands firmly clasped together. "My mother was a beautiful person who spent her life caring for others, her clients, her family, even strangers who needed help," Elisa said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her expression. "She died trying to save my brother from a path that would destroy him. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. There are no winners today. My mother is gone forever, and now my brother will spend decades in prison for taking her from us." Elisa paused, visibly struggling to maintain her composure, before continuing, "I hope that other families might learn from our tragedy that parents will look more closely at sudden changes in their teenagers' behavior, that young people will recognize the warning signs of being manipulated into criminal activity, and that everyone will remember that choices made in moments of anger or fear can destroy many lives forever." As night fell over Miami, Eric Akins was transported back to the juvenile detention facility where he would remain until sentencing, his status as a minor still requiring separation from adult inmates despite being tried and convicted as an adult. In his cell, according to detention officers, he finally displayed the emotional reaction that had been largely absent throughout the trial, sobbing uncontrollably for several hours as the reality of his situation fully manifested. The exotic blue feather that had connected him to both the wildlife smuggling operation and his mother's murder remained in the evidence room at the Miami-Dade courthouse, sealed in its plastic bag, with Monica's blood still visible on its brilliant blue surface, a silent witness to how quickly and completely a young life could be derailed by criminal influence, poor choices, and one moment of violence that could never be undone. The guilty verdicts dominated local news coverage, with legal analysts generally agreeing that the overwhelming physical evidence, particularly the exotic feather with its damning blood spatter pattern and DNA connections, had left the jury with little choice, despite the defense's compelling narrative about teenage vulnerability and manipulation. The story extended beyond Miami, with national media using the case to highlight both the problem of wildlife trafficking and the vulnerability of teenagers to criminal recruitment and exploitation. Conservation organizations issued statements about the case, emphasizing how the illegal exotic animal trade not only threatened endangered species but also corrupted vulnerable young people, and, in this instance, led directly to a tragic murder that had destroyed a family. As Miami residents followed the coverage, many reflected on the dual tragedies represented by the case: the loss of Monica Akins's life and the effective loss of her son's future, both sacrificed to the allure and ruthlessness of a criminal enterprise that traded in the exploitation of rare species and vulnerable teenagers, with equal disregard for the damage caused. 6 weeks after the guilty verdicts, Eric Akins returned to the Miami-Dade County Courthouse for his sentencing hearing, the intervening period having been used for the preparation of pre-sentencing reports and impact statements from those affected by his crimes. The 17-year-old had visibly changed. Even in that short time, his face thinner and his demeanor more subdued, the juvenile detention facility's institutional routine having stripped away the last vestiges of the cocky persona he had cultivated during his involvement with the smuggling operation. Judge Raymond Ortiz's courtroom was again filled to capacity, with spectators and journalists crowding the gallery to witness the final chapter in a case that had captivated public attention through its unique combination of wildlife trafficking, family tragedy, and the corruption of a teenager by sophisticated criminal influences. Security had been increased following online threats against Eric, reflecting the intense public emotion the case had generated, particularly among those who viewed matricide as deserving of the harshest possible punishment, regardless of the defendant's age. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements, providing those most affected by Eric's crimes the opportunity to address the court regarding the consequences of his actions. Trevor Snye approached the podium first, his hand still bearing visible scars from the scissor attack 6 months earlier, his career as a delivery driver now permanently compromised by the nerve damage he had suffered. "I lost not just my ability to fully use my hands," Trevor stated, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face, "but also the mother-in-law who welcomed me into her family when I had none of my own, the peace of mind that came with feeling safe in our community, and the brother-in-law I thought I knew." Trevor described the ongoing physical therapy he required and the financial strain caused by his reduced work capacity, but emphasized that these practical challenges paled in comparison to the emotional trauma of watching his wife, Elisa, navigate the dual grief of losing both her mother to violence and her brother to the criminal justice system. No sentence can heal these wounds, Trevor concluded, but justice requires consequences proportionate to the devastation Eric's choices have caused. When Elisa Snye approached the podium, the courtroom fell completely silent, all eyes on the young woman who had lost her mother to her brother's violence. Unlike Trevor, Elisa struggled to maintain her composure, her voice breaking repeatedly as she addressed the court. "My mother was everything to our family, the foundation, the peacemaker, the one who held us together through every challenge," she began, gripping the podium for support. "She worked so hard to give both Eric and me opportunities she never had, sacrificing her own dreams to ensure we could pursue ours. And when she saw Eric heading down a dangerous path, she did what she had always done, tried to protect him, even if it meant making difficult choices." Elisa described the emptiness of family gatherings now, the constant reminders of Monica's absence in everyday life, and the nightmares that still plagued her, where she repeatedly discovered her mother's body and was powerless to help. Most poignantly, she addressed her brother directly for the first time since the murder. "Eric, Mom's last act was trying to save you, and I hope someday you understand what that means, that even in her final moments, her love for you was stronger than her fear of what you might do. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you, but I know she would want me to try." Several of Monica's elderly clients from Sunset Palms Assisted Living Facility had submitted written statements that were read aloud by a victim advocate, describing how Monica's murder had affected some of society's most vulnerable members. 92-year-old Beatrice Coleman's statement was particularly moving. "Monica was the only person who could get me to take my medications without a fight. The only one who remembered all my grandchildren's names and birthdays. When she was killed, I lost more than a caregiver. I lost someone who made me feel human again instead of just an old woman waiting to die." These statements highlighted the ripple effects of Monica's murder beyond her immediate family, demonstrating how a single act of violence had diminished the quality of life for numerous elderly individuals who had depended on her skills and compassion. The victim advocate also read a collective statement from Monica's colleagues describing how her absence had created an irreplaceable void in their workplace and how they struggled to explain her sudden, violent death to confused elderly residents who continued to ask for her weeks after she was gone. When the time came for statements from the defense, Dr. Patricia Winters returned to the stand to provide additional context regarding Eric's psychological development and the factors that had contributed to his criminal behavior. The adolescent psychologist emphasized research showing that teenage brains, particularly the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and consequence assessment, continue developing well into the mid-20s. This neurobiological reality doesn't excuse Eric's actions, Dr. Winters clarified, but it does help explain his particular vulnerability to manipulation by older criminals and his diminished capacity to fully appreciate the long-term consequences of his choices. The psychologist recommended that any sentence include access to comprehensive psychological counseling, educational opportunities, and rehabilitation programs specifically designed for juvenile offenders, arguing that Eric's age and still developing brain offered significant potential for rehabilitation if given appropriate intervention rather than purely punitive measures. Maria Gonzalez presented the court with letters from Eric's former teachers and coaches who expressed shock at his transformation from a once promising student with an interest in biology and environmental science to a convicted murderer. His 10th grade biology teacher wrote, "The Eric I knew was passionate about wildlife conservation and had expressed interest in studying zoology in college. The cruel irony that he became involved in trafficking the very species he once sought to protect suggests how completely his moral compass was recalibrated by negative influences. These character statements, while acknowledging the horror of Eric's crime, sought to present a more complete picture of the defendant as someone who had once shown promise and positive qualities before falling under the influence of sophisticated criminals who had deliberately targeted and exploited his adolescent vulnerabilities. Eric himself was the last to address the court, rising shakily from the defense table when Judge Ortiz invited him to speak. The teenager had prepared a written statement, but set it aside after a moment's hesitation, choosing instead to speak extemporaneously in a voice that wavered between childlike uncertainty and forced maturity. "I know nothing I say can bring my mom back or fix what I did to Trevor," Eric began, his eyes fixed on the podium rather than meeting the gazes of those in the courtroom. "I keep trying to understand how I got from being a normal kid who loved animals to someone who could—" He paused, visibly struggling with articulating the reality of his actions. "Who could hurt my own mother when she was just trying to help me? Zach made the smuggling operation seem exciting at first, like I was special for being included. The money and attention felt good, and by the time I realized how deep I was in, it seemed too late to get out." Eric continued, his voice breaking as he addressed his sister directly. "Elisa, I'm sorry I took Mom from you, from all of us. I'm sorry I hurt Trevor when he was just trying to help. I'm sorry I can't fix any of this." He then acknowledged the broader impacts of his actions. "I also understand now that the animals we were trafficking are endangered, that what we were doing was pushing them closer to extinction. Mom tried to tell me this, to make me see what I was really involved in, and instead of listening, Eric couldn't complete the sentence, his composure finally breaking as the full weight of his actions seemed to settle on him. "I deserve whatever sentence I receive," he concluded simply, before returning to his seat, shoulders slumped under the burden of guilt he would carry for the remainder of his life. Judge Ortiz took time to consider all the statements and materials presented before delivering his sentencing decision, his expression grave as he addressed the courtroom. "This case represents a tragedy on multiple levels," he began. "The loss of Monica Aiken's life, the serious injury to Trevor Snye, the destruction of a family, and yes, the effective loss of a young man's future through his own terrible choices. While the court acknowledges the neurobiological realities of adolescent brain development and the manipulation Eric Akins experienced at the hands of older criminals, these factors must be balanced against the calculated nature of his actions in silencing both his mother and brother-in-law to protect his involvement in a criminal enterprise." The judge noted that Eric's decision to attack Trevor with scissors after killing Monica demonstrated a level of premeditation and consciousness of guilt that couldn't be dismissed as merely impulsive teenage behavior, and that his subsequent attempts to flee the country rather than taking responsibility for his actions further indicated an understanding of the wrongfulness of his conduct. "Taking all factors into consideration," Judge Ortiz continued, "including the defendant's age, the influence of adult criminals on his behavior, the brutality of the crimes committed, and the devastating impact on the victims and community, this court sentences Eric Akins to 40 years in state prison for the murder of Monica Akins, with an additional consecutive sentence of 15 years for the attempted murder of Trevor Snye." The judge specified that Eric would initially be held in a juvenile facility until his 18th birthday, after which he would be transferred to adult custody with eligibility for parole consideration after serving 25 years of his sentence. He also ordered that Eric participate in educational programs, psychological counseling, and rehabilitation services throughout his incarceration, noting that the defendant's young age offered at least the possibility of eventual rehabilitation despite the severity of his crimes. "No sentence can restore what has been lost," Judge Ortiz concluded, "but justice requires meaningful consequences for taking a human life, particularly in circumstances where that life was ended to conceal criminal activity. As the sentencing concluded, the exotic blue feather that had played such a crucial role in the case was permanently sealed into the evidence archive, its journey from the wing of an endangered Spix's macaw to a blood-stained crime scene to a courtroom exhibit now complete. The wildlife trafficking investigation sparked by Monica's murder continued to expand in the months following Eric's sentencing, with federal agencies using information from his confession and the evidence recovered from Rafael Mendez's operation to identify and dismantle connected smuggling networks across 3 continents. 8 months after the trial, authorities in Colombia, Brazil, and the United States conducted coordinated raids that resulted in the arrests of 27 individuals involved in the exotic animal trade, including several wealthy collectors who had purchased Spix's macaws and other critically endangered species from Mendez's organization. The rescued animals, including the 2 macaws found in the van with Eric and Zach, were transferred to legitimate conservation programs, providing a small but meaningful counterbalance to the tragedy that had exposed the smuggling network. The case left a lasting impact on Miami's approach to both wildlife trafficking and juvenile crime. The Miami-Dade Police Department established a specialized unit focused on wildlife trafficking, recognizing that the exotic animal trade often intersected with other criminal enterprises and could lead to violence beyond the ecological damage caused by the trafficking itself. Detective James Davis, whose recognition of the significance of the exotic feather had broken the case open, was appointed to lead this new unit, bringing his experience from the Akins case to bear on other instances of rare animal smuggling throughout South Florida. The department also implemented enhanced training for officers to recognize signs of juvenile involvement in organized crime and to understand the sophisticated recruitment and grooming tactics used by adult criminals to exploit teenagers for their operations. In the educational realm, Monica's death led to the development of a prevention program implemented in Miami-Dade County schools, designed to help teenagers recognize and resist criminal recruitment. The Monica Akins initiative included curriculum addressing the warning signs of criminal grooming, the legal consequences of involvement in illegal activities, and strategies for seeking help when approached by those offering too good to be true opportunities or pressuring them toward illegal behavior. The program featured powerful testimonials from incarcerated young people who, like Eric, had been recruited into criminal enterprises with promises of money, status, and excitement, only to find themselves facing lengthy prison sentences after the situation escalated beyond their control. Elisa Snye occasionally participated in these programs, sharing her family's story as a cautionary tale about how quickly criminal involvement could escalate to tragedy. For the Snye family, recovery remained an ongoing process with no clear endpoint. Trevor's physical injuries gradually improved with continued therapy, though he never regained full dexterity in his right hand and eventually had to transition from delivery driving to a warehouse management position that required less manual precision. Elisa completed her nursing degree, finding that following in her mother's footsteps of caring for others provided some measure of healing for her own wounds. The couple established a small foundation in Monica's name that provided scholarships for children of single parents pursuing careers in healthcare, attempting to create something positive from the tragedy that had shattered their family. Though they visited Eric only sporadically during the initial years of his incarceration, the passage of time gradually softened some of their anger, allowing for limited communication focused on acknowledging the past while attempting to build some form of relationship for the future. Eric Akins's journey through the correctional system reflected the complex reality of juvenile offenders serving adult sentences. His first years of Incarceration were marked by depression and adjustment difficulties as he confronted the reality of having killed his mother and the decades of confinement that lay ahead. Gradually, with the help of counseling and educational programs, he began working toward his GED and later enrolled in college courses offered within the prison system. By his mid-20s, Eric had become involved in an inmate-led wildlife education program, using his knowledge of endangered species, once exploited for criminal profit, to educate other prisoners about conservation issues and the ecological impacts of wildlife trafficking. Though these efforts could never compensate for his crime, they represented his attempt to derive some meaning from his experience and perhaps honor his mother's original concerns about the animals he had helped to traffic. The case of Eric Akins and the exotic blue feather that had exposed both a murder and a wildlife smuggling operation became a reference point in legal, psychological, and criminological discussions about juvenile offenders, criminal recruitment, and the complex intersections between different types of crime. Law enforcement agencies across the country cited the case in training materials about the importance of recognizing unusual evidence at crime scenes and understanding how domestic violence can connect to broader criminal networks. Conservation organizations used the story to illustrate the hidden costs of wildlife trafficking beyond the ecological impact, emphasizing how the illegal trade in endangered species creates ripples of harm that can culminate in violence and destroyed lives. Academic researchers studied the case as an example of how adolescent vulnerability to manipulation intersects with organized crime's deliberate targeting of teenagers, generating recommendations for prevention, intervention, and rehabilitation strategies. 10 years after Monica Akins's murder, a small memorial garden was established at Sunset Palms Assisted Living Facility, featuring plants native to Florida and a simple plaque commemorating her years of service to the elderly residents. The garden included a specially designed habitat for local butterflies and birds, reflecting Monica's love of gardening and wildlife. A cruel irony given that her son's involvement with exotic animals had ultimately led to her death. On the anniversary of her passing each year, current and former staff members gathered in this peaceful space to remember a colleague whose compassion had touched countless lives and whose tragic death had triggered changes in how Miami addressed both wildlife trafficking and the exploitation of teenagers by criminal organizations. Though Monica was gone, her legacy continued through these ripples of positive change, the scholarships bearing her name, and the prevention programs that might save other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The exotic blue feather that had connected Eric to both the wildlife smuggling operation and his mother's murder remained preserved in the evidence archives, its brilliant color undimmed by time, though forever stained with the blood of a mother who had died trying to save her son from a path that would destroy him. In a case filled with bitter ironies, perhaps the most poignant was that Monica's final act, confronting Eric about his involvement with endangered animals, had indeed ultimately led to the dismantling of the smuggling network and the rescue of numerous rare creatures, including the very Spix's macaws from which the feather had come. Though she could not save her own son from the consequences of his choices, Monica Akins had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would save these critically endangered birds and potentially help other parents recognize and intervene before their own children were lost to the allure of criminal enterprises that trade in both rare species and vulnerable teenagers with equal disregard for the damage done.